Part 1. The awakening of the nightmare 1347. The autumn of 1347 dawned like any other across the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean. Merchants haggled over silk and spices in the crowded harbors of Genoa, Marseille, and Messina. Ships arrived daily, their holds heavy with treasures from the east. Precious fabrics, exotic perfumes, and a coveted black pepper that was worth its weight in silver. The maritime trade routes that connected Europe to Asia pulsed with life and commerce, the arteries of a thriving medieval economy. Yet within these very vessels of prosperity, an ancient terror was awakening from its slumber in the steppes of Central Asia, preparing to unleash upon Europe the most devastating catastrophe in human history. The fateful voyage. The first harbinger of doom arrived not with fanfare, but with an eerie silence that should have been the merchant's first warning. In October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys limped into the harbor of Messina, Sicily, their usual proud banners hanging limp and tattered in the Mediterranean breeze. These were not the triumphant merchant vessels that typically announced their arrival with horns and shouts of celebration. Instead, they drifted like ghost ships, their decks ominously quiet save for creaking of wood and the gentle lapping of waves against their hulls. As harbor officials and curious onlookers gathered at the docks, expecting to see the usual bustle of sailors preparing to unload their valuable cargo, they were met with a sight that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. The few crew members who staggered onto the gangplanks were barely recognizable as human beings. Their faces were gaunt and pale as morning mist, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls like dark wells. Black boils, some as large as chicken eggs, protruded grotesquely from their necks and armpits, while others displayed the telltale dark patches under their skin that gave the disease its terrifying nickname, the Black Death. Most shocking of all was the silence of those who should have been calling out orders or greetings. When these walking specters attempted to speak, many could only produce strangled gasps or violent coughing fits that sprayed dark blood across the wooden planks beneath their feet. Those who managed to form words spoke in delirious whispers about terrible storms, about crew members who had died screaming in agony, and about rats. Countless rats that had overrun their ships before dying themselves in writhing masses. The merchants of death. Among the survivors was a Genoese merchant named Antonio di Marco, whose detailed account would later be preserved by a Franciscan monk. Di Marco described the voyage as a descent into hell that began innocuously enough in the bustling port of Caffa, on the shores of the Black Sea. The ships had loaded their usual cargo of luxury goods, but also something far more sinister: rats infected with fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. "We departed Caffa as merchants," Di Marco reportedly told a monk in his dying confession, "but we arrived as merchants of death itself." His words, though spoken in delirium, would prove prophetically accurate. The merchant described how, during the long journey westward, crew members began falling ill with mysterious fevers. At first, the symptoms appeared to be nothing more than the usual maladies that sometimes afflicted sailors: seasickness, bad food, or the strain of hard labor under the Mediterranean sun. But this was no ordinary illness. Within days of the first symptoms appearing, strong men who had survived countless voyages across treacherous seas were reduced to writhing shadows of their former selves. The disease seemed to attack with malevolent intelligence, striking down the healthiest crew members first, while sometimes sparing the weak. Di Marco watched in horror as his business partner, a robust man named Giuseppe, who could lift cargo barrels that required 2 ordinary men, was dead within 3 days of his first complaint of fever. The most terrifying aspect of the voyage, according to Di Marco's account, was not just a rapid death of the crew, but the way the disease seemed to spread through the air itself. Men who had no contact with the sick would suddenly develop the same ghastly symptoms. The rats that infested the cargo holds began dying in such numbers that their small corpses had to be shoveled overboard daily, creating a gruesome trail across the Mediterranean that following ships would report for weeks afterward. The pestilent harbor. As word of the ghost ship spread through Messina, the city's authorities faced an unprecedented crisis. The harbor master, a seasoned official named Gabriele Musio, had dealt with 6 sailors before, but nothing had prepared him for the scene that greeted him aboard the Genoese vessels. In his official report to the city council, Musio described finding ships where the living were outnumbered by the dead, and where the distinction between the two was becoming increasingly difficult to determine. The cargo holds, once filled with precious goods, had become floating mausoleums. Bolts of silk were stained with blood and vomit. Sacks of spices were contaminated with the excrement of dying rats, and the very air inside the ships had become thick with the sweet, nauseating stench of decomposition. Musio noted that even breathing inside these vessels caused immediate nausea and dizziness, as if the very atmosphere had been poisoned. More disturbing still were the rats. The harbor master reported that these rodents, typically clever and quick to flee danger, seemed disoriented and sluggish. Many were found dead with the same dark swellings that afflicted the human victims, while others stumbled about in daylight, behavior completely contrary to their nocturnal nature. The rats that were still alive appeared almost drunk, staggering in circles before collapsing in convulsions that lasted several minutes before death claimed them. The local physicians who were summoned to examine the sick sailors were equally baffled and terrified by what they witnessed. Dr. Michel de Piazza, the city's most respected medical practitioner, later wrote that the disease defied all known medical knowledge. It attacks not just the body, he recorded in his journal, but seems to corrupt the very essence of life itself. The victims develop a fever so intense that their skin becomes hot to the touch, yet they shiver as if trapped in eternal winter. The scent of doom, perhaps most unnerving of all, was a smell that began to permeate the harbor district of Messina. It was not simply the odor of death, which the residents of medieval port city were accustomed to encountering. This was something far more sinister, a sweet, cloying fragrance that seemed to combine the worst aspects of rotting flowers, spoiled meat, and something indefinably alien that made even the strongest stomachs revolt. The stench seemed to have a life of its own, creeping through the narrow streets like an invisible serpent. It seeped through closed windows and wooden doors, contaminated fresh bread and bakeries, and caused wine to sour in its barrels. Pregnant women reported that the smell triggered immediate nausea and strange dreams, while children began crying inexplicably when the wind carried the odor from the harbor into the residential quarters. Local residents who worked near the docks noticed that dogs and cats, usually abundant in port cities where food scraps were plentiful, began disappearing. Those animals that remained displayed highly unusual behavior. They avoided the harbor entirely, creating an eerie silence where the usual barking and meowing of urban wildlife should have provided a comforting backdrop to daily life. Even the seagulls, those ever-present scavengers of maritime cities, seemed to sense the danger and fled to distant shores. The first victims. Within days of the ghost ship's arrival, the first residents of Messina began displaying the same horrifying symptoms that had decimated the ship's crews. The initial victims were predictably those who had been in direct contact with the vessels, dock workers, customs officials, and the few brave physicians who had attempted to treat the dying sailors. But the disease's hunger for victims proved insatiable. Maria Benedetta, a tavern keeper whose establishment catered to sailors and merchants, was among the first townspeople to succumb. Her tavern, located just steps from the harbor, had been a gathering place for crews looking to celebrate successful voyages with wine and warm meals. Within a week of serving drinks to some of the surviving sailors from the Genoese ships, Maria began experiencing the telltale fever and nausea that marked the disease's early stages. Her daughter, Isabella, later provided a harrowing account of her mother's final days to local church officials. She complained first of a terrible headache, Isabella recalled, as if someone was driving nails into her skull. Then came the fever that made her skin burn like fire, followed by vomiting that brought up not food, but a dark substance that looked like old blood mixed with ink. The most terrifying aspect of Maria's illness, according to her daughter, was how quickly it progressed. On Monday, she was serving customers and laughing at their jokes, Isabella reported. By Wednesday, she could barely stand, and by Friday, Isabella's account ended there, unable to describe the final stages of her mother's agony. The spreading shadow. As autumn deepened into winter, the mysterious disease began its relentless march to Messina's population. What had started as isolated cases among those who had direct contact with the infected ships quickly evolved into something far more terrifying, a contagion that seemed to spread through the very air people breathed. The city's religious leaders, initially confident that prayer and penance would provide protection against this divine trial, found themselves as vulnerable as anyone else. Father Giuseppe Romano, the head priest of Messina's main cathedral, fell ill after administering last rites to several victims. His deterioration was particularly shocking to the faithful, as he had been regarded as a man of exceptional piety and divine favor. The priest's illness sent shockwaves through the community's religious foundation. If a man who dedicated his life to God's service could fall victim to this plague, what hope did ordinary sinners have? This question would soon evolve into one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the Black Death. Not just the physical suffering it caused, but the spiritual crisis it triggered among survivors who began to question everything they believed about divine justice and protection. The city holds its breath. By December 1347, Messina had become a city transformed by fear. The once bustling marketplace, where merchants from across the Mediterranean had gathered to trade goods and share news from distant lands, stood nearly empty. The few brave souls who ventured out to purchase necessities moved quickly and avoided eye contact with their neighbors, as if human connection itself had become dangerous. The harbor, once the pride of the city and the source of its prosperity, had become a place of dread. The Genoese ships that had brought the plague were eventually burned at anchor, their destruction creating pillars of black smoke that could be seen for miles across the Mediterranean. Yet the damage was already done. The seeds of Europe's greatest catastrophe had been planted in the fertile soil of medieval society. As the year drew to a close, reports began arriving from other port cities along the Mediterranean coast. Genoa, Marseille, Barcelona, all were reporting similar mysterious illnesses among their populations. The merchant networks that had once been the arteries of prosperity were now serving as highways for death itself, carrying plague from city to city with the efficiency of a well-organized military campaign. The nightmare that had begun with a few ghost ships limping into a Sicilian harbor was about to engulf an entire continent. The Black Death had awakened from its ancient slumber, and medieval Europe was about to discover just how fragile the thin veneer of civilization truly was when faced with nature's most terrifying weapon. Pandemic disease unleashed upon an unsuspecting and vulnerable population. The merchants who had unknowingly transported this catastrophe across the Mediterranean could never have imagined that their final voyage would mark not just the end of their own lives, but the beginning of the end for the medieval world as it had existed for centuries. The awakening of the nightmare was complete, and there would be no return to the innocent autumn of 1347, when ships brought only spices and silk, not death and devastation to the shores of Europe. Part 2. The Signs of the Apocalypse. As the Black Death spread from its initial foothold in Mediterranean ports throughout the winter of 1347 and into 1348, physicians, clergy, and ordinary citizens across Europe began to witness something that defied all understanding of human suffering. This was not merely another disease to be cataloged alongside the familiar ailments that periodically swept through medieval communities. This was something fundamentally different, a malevolent force that seemed designed by the darkest imagination to inflict maximum agony upon its victims, while simultaneously stripping away every vestige of human dignity. The disease manifested itself in ways so horrific that those who witnessed its effects struggled to find words adequate to describe what they saw. Even the most learned physicians of the age, men who had dedicated their lives to understanding the human body and its ailments, found themselves confronted with symptoms that appeared to mock everything they thought they knew about medicine and mortality. The bubonic terror, when the body betrays itself. The most common and recognizable form of the plague was what would later be classified as bubonic plague, named for the grotesque swellings that became its most distinctive and terrifying signature. These buboes, as they came to be known, represented the human lymphatic system's desperate and ultimately futile attempt to fight off the invading bacteria that had overwhelmed the body's defenses. Dr. Giovanni Matteo of Florence, one of the few physicians to survive the plague years and document his observations, described his first encounter with a bubonic plague victim in clinical detail that barely concealed his horror. "The patient was brought to me in the early morning hours," he wrote in his medical journal. "A merchant named Bartolomeo who had been conducting business in the harbor district. Upon initial examination, he appeared to suffer from nothing more than a severe fever, complaining of intense headaches and nausea that prevented him from keeping down even water. But within hours of that initial examination, Matteo witnessed a transformation that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. By midday, small lumps had appeared beneath his arms, no larger than walnuts. I prescribed the usual remedies, bleeding to balance the humors and herbal poultices to draw out the corruption. But when I returned the following morning, I found not small lumps but monstrous growths that defied all natural law. The buboes that developed with such terrifying speed were indeed monstrous in their appearance and effect, starting as small, tender nodules in the lymph nodes of the neck, armpits, and groin. They would swell with alarming rapidity until they resembled nothing so much as rotting fruit. The largest could reach the size of apples or even melons, stretching the skin until it became thin and translucent, revealing the corruption beneath. These swellings were not merely disfiguring. They were excruciatingly painful. Victims described the sensation as if molten metal had been poured into their bodies, creating nodes of pure agony that made even the slightest movement unbearable. The pain was so intense that many patients became completely immobilized, unable to lift their arms or turn their heads without screaming in agony. Caterina Di Marco, a silk weaver from Venice whose detailed account was preserved by the city's health officials, provided a harrowing description of her husband's suffering. The lumps grew so large and hard that his shirts could no longer fit over them, she testified. When I tried to help him drink water, the mere pressure of lifting his arm caused him to cry out as if I were torturing him with hot irons. The pain was so severe that he begged me to cut off his arms, saying death would be preferable to such agony. But the physical pain was only the beginning of the bubonic plague's assault on its victims. As the bacteria multiplied and spread to the bloodstream, patients began experiencing symptoms that seemed to attack not just their bodies, but their very sanity. High fevers, often reaching temperatures that should have been fatal in themselves, caused violent shaking and delirium that left victims unable to recognize their own family members. The pneumonic horror, death in every breath. While the bubonic form of the plague was terrifying in its visible manifestations, physicians soon encountered an even more deadly variant that attacked the respiratory system with devastating efficiency. Pneumonic plague, as it would later be known, transformed the simple act of breathing into an instrument of torture and death. Unlike bubonic plague, which required the bite of an infected flea to transmit the disease, pneumonic plague could spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, a fact that medieval physicians observed but could not understand. This airborne transmission made it far more contagious and exponentially more dangerous in the crowded conditions of medieval cities. Father Benedetto Agnoli, a Franciscan monk who ministered to plague victims in Milan, left a detailed account of his encounters with pneumonic plague that reveals both his dedication to his calling and his growing horror at what he witnessed. "I was summoned to provide last rites for a family of 6, he wrote in a letter to his superior, who had all fallen ill within the space of 2 days. When I arrived at their dwelling, I found them in various stages of a malady that attacked their very breath. The symptoms of pneumonic plague were as distinctive as they were deadly. Victims would initially complain of chest pain and difficulty breathing, as if an invisible weight were pressing down upon their lungs. This would rapidly progress to violent coughing fits that produced not the clear or yellowish phlegm associated with ordinary respiratory ailments, but a horrifying mixture of blood, pus, and dark matter that witnesses consistently described as resembling ink or tar. The youngest child, a girl perhaps 8 years, Father Agnoli continued, could no longer speak above a whisper due to the blood that filled her throat. Each attempt to breathe produced a gurgling sound that will haunt my prayers until my dying day. Her mother, attempting to comfort the child, began coughing so violently that dark blood sprayed across the wall behind her bed, creating patterns that looked like some demonic script. The pneumonic form progressed with even greater speed than its bubonic counterpart, often killing victims within 24 to 48 hours of the first symptoms appearing. This rapid progression meant that families could be entirely wiped out within a matter of days, leaving entire households silent and empty in a time span that seemed to mock the natural order of life and death. Dr. Almanzar ibn Khatib, a Moorish physician working in Granada, provided perhaps the most clinical description of pneumonic plague's progression. The corruption begins in the lungs but spreads with such speed that it seems to poison the very air within the body, he observed. The patient's breath becomes labored, then painful, then impossible. In the final stages, they drown not in water, but in their own corrupted blood, while their loved ones can only watch in helpless horror. What made pneumonic plague particularly terrifying was not just its speed, but its apparent randomness. Unlike bubonic plague, which seemed to require direct contact with infected individuals or environments, pneumonic plague could strike anyone who happened to breathe the same air as a victim. This led to a paranoia about the very act of breathing that would have profound psychological effects on survivors. The septicemic nightmare. Blood turned to poison. The third and most rapidly fatal form of the plague was septicemic plague, which attacked the bloodstream directly and killed with such speed that victims sometimes died before any external symptoms could manifest. This variant was the most mysterious to medieval observers, as people who appeared perfectly healthy could collapse and die within hours, leading to widespread fears about the very air and water becoming poisoned. Septicemic plague victims experience what can only be described as their blood turning against them. The bacteria multiplied so rapidly in the bloodstream that they effectively poisoned the victim from within, causing a systemic collapse that was both swift and agonizing. The most visible sign of this internal corruption was the appearance of dark patches under the skin, subcutaneous bleeding that created bruise-like marks across the body. These dark patches, which gave the Black Death its name, were not ordinary bruises, but signs of the body's circulatory system failing catastrophically. As blood vessels weakened and ruptured under the assault of bacterial toxins, victims would develop what appeared to be massive bruises that spread across their bodies like ink stains on parchment. Master Thomas de Bradwardine, physician to the court of Edward III of England, documented his encounter with septicemic plague in a report that was among the first to recognize this as a distinct form of the disease. I was summoned to attend Lady Eleanor, who had complained of nothing more than slight fatigue after breaking her fast, he wrote. When I arrived at her chambers, I found her collapsed upon her bed, her skin bearing marks as if she had been beaten with clubs, though no violence had been done to her person. The speed of septicemic plague was its most terrifying characteristic. Victims could appear healthy in the morning and be dead by evening, sometimes without developing any of the distinctive symptoms that marked the other forms of the disease. This led to a particular horror among the living, as it seemed that death could strike without warning, invisible and inexorable. The corruption moves to the blood like fire through dry straw, observed Ibn al-Khatib, the great historian of Granada, who witnessed the plague's devastation in Islamic Spain. I have seen strong men, warriors who had survived countless battles, brought low in the span of a single day by an enemy they could neither see nor fight. The dark patches that characterized septicemic plague were often accompanied by gangrene of the extremities, as the compromised blood supply could no longer sustain the body's tissues. Fingers and toes would turn black and begin to rot while the victim was still alive, creating a grotesque preview of the decay that would claim the entire body after death. The delirium of the dying. Across all three forms of the plague, one of the most disturbing symptoms was a severe delirium that accompanied the final stages of the disease. As bacterial toxins affected the brain and high fevers ravaged the nervous system, victims would often spend their final hours or days in states of profound mental confusion that were as distressing to witness as the physical symptoms. Sister Margherita of Bologna, a nun who ministered to plague victims at the city's largest hospital, documented numerous cases of plague delirium in her journal. They speak to people who are not there, she wrote, carrying on conversations with the dead as if they were sitting beside their beds. Some cry out warnings about demons or angels, while others recite prayers backwards or speak in tongues that no earthly ear can understand. The delirium took many forms, but certain patterns emerged that witnesses found particularly disturbing. Many victims seemed to experience visions of apocalyptic imagery, describing in vivid detail scenes of hellfire, armies of demons, or the opening of graves and the resurrection of the dead. These visions were so consistent across different regions and social classes that many began to believe the plague was indeed a supernatural phenomenon rather than a natural disease. Young Marco, the baker's son, spent his final night describing a battle between angels and devils that he claimed to see raging above our city. Sister Margherita recorded. He provided such detailed accounts of the celestial war that even our most skeptical physicians began to look nervously toward the sky, wondering what signs they might have missed. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the cases where victims, in their delirium, failed to recognize their own families. Parents would call out for children who stood weeping at their bedsides, Or spouses would speak tenderly to hallucinated lovers while their actual partners held their hands. This psychological cruelty seemed to many observers to be evidence that the plague was not merely a disease, but a deliberate act of divine punishment designed to maximize human suffering. The transformation complete. In the final stages of all three forms of plague, witnesses reported a transformation that seemed to strip away the very essence of humanity from the victims. The combination of physical disfigurement, extreme pain, delirium, and the rapid progression of decay created beings that barely resembled the people they had been just days earlier. They become something other than human, wrote Geoffrey Lubaker, an English chronicler who witnessed the plague's devastation in Oxfordshire. The disease does not merely kill. It transforms its victims into warnings of mortality that terrify the living and mock our pretensions to dignity and civilization. The speed of this transformation was perhaps its most shocking aspect. Strong, healthy individuals could be reduced to unrecognizable shadows of their former selves within 72 hours of the first symptoms appearing. This rapid descent into what appeared to be living death created a psychological trauma among survivors that would mark European culture for generations. As the plague spread throughout 1348 and beyond, these horrific symptoms became a familiar, yet never less terrifying sight across Europe. The signs of the apocalypse had indeed arrived, written not in the stars or in prophetic texts, but in the corrupted flesh of millions of victims whose suffering would serve as humanity's introduction to one of nature's most perfect weapons against civilization itself. The physical manifestations of the Black Death were not merely medical symptoms to be cataloged and treated. They were harbingers of complete breakdown of the medieval world order, visible proof that the thin veneer of human civilization could be stripped away in a matter of days by an enemy too small to see but too powerful to resist. Part 3. The Collapse of Social Order. By the spring of 1348, the Black Death had accomplished something that no invading army, natural disaster, or political upheaval had managed to achieve in centuries of European history. It had begun to systematically dismantle the very foundations of medieval society. The carefully constructed hierarchies, obligations, and traditions that had governed human behavior for generations crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. What emerged from this collapse was not a reformed society, but something far more primitive and terrifying, a world where the basic bonds between human beings dissolved in the face of mortal terror. The dissolution of social order did not happen overnight, but rather unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of abandonment, each section of society contributing its own movement to the overall collapse. Physicians, priests, magistrates, parents, children, all the roles that had defined medieval life began to lose their meaning as survival instinct overrode centuries of cultural conditioning and moral obligation. The flight of the healers. Perhaps no betrayal cut deeper into the heart of medieval society than the abandonment of the sick by those sworn to heal them. The medical profession, such as it existed in the 14th century, was built upon the fundamental premise that physicians had a sacred duty to tend the afflicted, regardless of personal risk. This obligation was not merely professional, but deeply spiritual, as medicine was viewed as a divine call that required practitioners to model themselves after Christ the healer. Yet as the plague's true horror became apparent, this noble ideal crumbled with shocking speed. Dr. Gentile de Foligno, one of the most respected physicians in all of Europe and professor at the University of Padua, initially attempted to maintain his professional duties when the plague reached the city. His transformation from dedicated healer to terrified fugitive illustrates the complete breakdown of medical ethics that characterized the plague years. In his early writings from 1348, de Foligno demonstrated the confidence and authority expected of a medieval physician. The learned doctor must not flee from his duty, he wrote, for God has placed knowledge in our hands not for our own benefit, but for the service of our fellow Christians in their hour of greatest need. He prescribed elaborate treatments involving bleeding, purging, and complex herbal remedies, maintaining a facade of medical authority even as his patients died with alarming regularity. But as spring turned to summer and the death toll mounted exponentially, de Foligno's writings began to reveal a growing desperation and fear. The corruption spreads faster than our understanding, he admitted in a letter to a colleague in Bologna. Each day brings new cases that mock our learning and render our treatments meaningless. We are not healers in the face of this evil. We are merely witnesses to our own ignorance. the final entry in the Foligno's medical journal, found after his own death from plague, revealed a complete collapse of professional resolve. I can no longer pretend that knowledge provides protection against this curse. My patients die whether I treat them or not, and each day I remain in their presence brings me closer to sharing their fate. God forgive me, but I cannot sacrifice my life for the pretense of providing help where none exists. The Foligno's intellectual and moral journey from confident healer to terrified fugitive was repeated across Europe as physicians abandoned their practices and fled to remote locations they hoped might provide safety. The University of Paris lost over half its medical faculty to either death or desertion. In London, the Royal College of Physicians simply ceased to function as an institution, its members either dead or scattered to countryside. The few physicians who attempted to maintain their practices found themselves overwhelmed not just by the sheer number of cases, but by the complete ineffectiveness of their treatments. Master John of Burgundy, who served several noble households in France, documented his growing despair. I have bled patients until they fainted, purged them until they could produce nothing but bile, and prescribed every remedy known to Christian medicine. Yet they die with the same regularity as those who receive no treatment at all. What purpose does a physician serve when his presence provides no more benefit than that of a common laborer? The abandonment of the sacred. If the flight of physicians represented betrayal of professional duty, the abandonment of parishes by clergy constituted something far more devastating, a crisis of faith that struck at the very heart of medieval spiritual authority. The Catholic Church had positioned itself as humanity's intermediary with the divine, promising that proper observance of religious duties would provide protection against earthly suffering and ensure salvation in the afterlife. The plague challenged these promises in the most direct possible way, killing the pious and impious with equal indifference while leaving prayers unanswered and sacraments powerless. Faced with this theological crisis, many members of the clergy simply fled their responsibilities, leaving their congregations to face the apocalypse without spiritual guidance. Father Guillaume de Machaut, who served a parish in the countryside near Paris, left a detailed account of his own moral collapse that reveals the psychological devastation experienced by many clerics. I entered the priesthood believing that God had called me to be a shepherd to his flock, he wrote in his confession. But when the wolf arrived at our door, I discovered that I was not a shepherd but merely another sheep, bleeding in terror and thinking only of my own preservation. De Machaut described how he initially attempted to maintain his duties, even as the plague began claiming members of his congregation. He performed last rites of the dying, conducted funeral masses of the dead, and offered comfort to the bereaved. But as the death toll mounted and he began to recognize his own mortality, his resolve began to crumble. Each time I entered a house where the sickness had taken hold, he wrote, I felt death breathing upon my neck. The holy oil that I carried to anoint the dying seemed to mock me. For what good did our sacraments do when God himself appeared to have abandoned us? I began to perform the rites with increasing haste, eager to complete my duties and escape the presence of the corruption. The breaking point came when de Machaut was summoned to provide last rites for a family of 7, including 3 young children. When I arrived at their dwelling, I found all 7 in various stages of the sickness. The stench was overwhelming, and the sounds of their suffering filled the air like the cries of the damned. I stood in their doorway, holy oil in hand, and found that I could not force myself to enter. That night, de Machaut packed his few belongings and fled to a monastery in the mountains, abandoning his parish to face the plague without spiritual succor. I told myself that I would return when the danger had passed, he confessed. But in my heart, I knew that I was simply a coward who had chosen my own life over the souls entrusted to my care. The institutional response of the church hierarchy was equally devastating. Pope Clement VI, initially confident in the power of papal authority to address the crisis, issued a series of increasingly desperate bulls promising plenary indulgences to anyone who died of the plague. When these spiritual rewards failed to slow the disease's progress, the papal court itself began to show signs of panic. Cardinal Giovanni Colonna, one of Clement's closest advisors, documented the growing hysteria within the papal palace at Avignon. His Holiness has taken to remaining in his private chambers, seeing no visitors and speaking to no one save through closed doors. The cardinals hold their meetings by written correspondence rather than gathering in person, each fearful that proximity to others might bring the corruption upon them. the disintegration of the family. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of social collapse was the breakdown of family bonds, relationships that medieval society considered sacred and inviolable. The family unit was not merely a social convenience, but the fundamental building block of Christian civilization, sanctified by religious doctrine and protected by centuries of legal tradition. Yet the plague's relentless advance created situations where the most basic family obligations became impossible to fulfill. Parents found themselves unable to care for sick children, spouses abandoned dying partners, and children fled from infected parents. These betrayals were not the result of moral weakness, but a simple, terrible calculus. Maintaining family bonds meant almost certain death, while abandonment offered at least the possibility of survival. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, writing from his refuge outside Florence, provided one of the most heartbreaking accounts of family dissolution. I have seen fathers refuse to visit their sons, mothers flee from their daughters, and brothers deny shelter to brothers. The natural affection that binds families together has been dissolved by fear, leaving each person isolated in their terror and concerned only with their own preservation. The case of the merchant family Alberti, one of Florence's most prominent and respected households, illustrates how quickly family loyalty could collapse under the plague's pressure. The family patriarch, Michele Alberti, initially insisted that the entire household would face the crisis together, declaring that the bonds of blood are stronger than any earthly pestilence. But when the plague entered the Alberti palazzo, killing Michele's wife and two youngest children within a week, the surviving family members began to scatter. His eldest son, Tommaso, took his own family and fled to a remote villa in the countryside. His daughter Caterina abandoned her sick husband to seek shelter in a convent. Even the household servants, some of whom had served the family for decades, disappeared in the night rather than risk tending to their dying master. Michele himself, weakened by grief and terror, ultimately died alone in his vast palazzo, surrounded by the material wealth that had once made him one of Florence's most envied citizens. His body was not discovered for nearly a week, as no one dared to enter the house to check on his welfare. The collapse of law and order. As family bonds dissolved and social institutions crumbled, the legal and administrative systems that maintained public order began to fail with alarming speed. Courts ceased to function as judges fled their posts or died at their benches. City councils could not achieve quorum as members either perished or abandoned their responsibilities. The complex web of laws, customs, and procedures that governed medieval life simply evaporated in the face of universal terror. In many cities, basic public services disappeared entirely. Garbage collection stopped, leading to the accumulation of refuse that attracted rats and other vermin. Water systems fell into disrepair as municipal workers either died or fled. Markets closed as merchants abandoned their businesses, creating food shortages that compounded the crisis. The city of Siena provides a particularly dramatic example of administrative collapse. The city's governing council, known as the Nine, had maintained careful records of the proceedings for over a century. These records suddenly stopped in mid-sentence on May 15, 1348, when the scribe apparently abandoned his post mid-meeting. The final entry reads, "The honorable members present discussed a matter of grain imports from," and then nothing, as if the very act of governance had simply ceased to exist. Without functioning legal systems, disputes that would normally be resolved through established procedures began to turn violent. Property rights became meaningless when there was no authority to enforce them. Inheritance laws collapsed as entire families died within days of each other, leaving vast estates with no clear ownership and no courts to adjudicate claims. The rise of primitive survival. As the structures of civilization crumbled, human behavior began to revert to its most primitive forms. The elaborate code of conduct that governed medieval society, chivalric honor, Christian charity, feudal obligation, were abandoned in favor of simple survival instincts. People began to hoard food and water, barricade themselves in their homes, and view every stranger as a potential carrier of death. In rural areas, the breakdown was perhaps even more complete than in cities. The feudal system, which had organized countryside life for generations, simply ceased to function as lords fled their estates and peasants abandoned their obligations. Crops rotted in fields because there was no one to harvest them. Livestock wandered free as their keepers either died or fled. The monastery of Cluny, once one of Europe's most powerful and wealthy religious institutions, saw its carefully maintained records of daily life simply end in September 1348. The final entry, written by Brother Antoine, reads, "The bells no longer ring for morning prayers because there is no one left to ring them. The wheat in our field stands ready for harvest, but our hands shake too much to wield the scythe. God forgive us, but we have become beasts concerned only with our own preservation." The new economics of death. As traditional economic systems collapsed, a bizarre new economy emerged based entirely on the logistics of death and survival. Professional mourners, grave diggers, and corpse carriers became some of the highest paid workers in Europe, commanding wages that would have been unimaginable before the plague. At the same time, luxury goods became virtually worthless, as no one had use for silk or spices when basic survival was uncertain. The chronicler Michel de Piazza described the economic inversion that occurred in Sicily. Gold and silver have lost their value. For what good are precious metals when there is no bread to buy with them? Meanwhile, a man who will remove corpses from houses can command payment that would have made him wealthy in normal times. This economic chaos further undermined social stability, as traditional markers of status and authority became meaningless. Noble families found themselves begging for help from former servants who had gained power through their willingness to handle the dead. Merchants who had spent lifetimes accumulating wealth discovered that their fortunes could not purchase the one thing they desperately needed: safety from plague. The point of no return. By the autumn of 1348, the collapse of social order had reached a point where restoration seemed impossible. Too many institutions had failed. Too many bonds had been broken. Too many people had chosen survival over duty for society to simply resume its previous form. The medieval world that had existed before the plague's arrival was not merely damaged. It had been fundamentally transformed into something new and terrifying. The plague had revealed that civilization was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. Beneath the elaborate structures of feudal obligation, religious authority, and family loyalty lay the raw human instinct for self-preservation. When that instinct was fully activated by mortal terror, it proved capable of dissolving bonds that had seemed unbreakable and destroying institutions that had appeared permanent. What emerged from its collapse was not chaos exactly, but a new and primitive form of human organization based entirely on fear and the struggle for survival. This was the world that the plague created. Not just a world with fewer people, but a world where the very meaning of human relationships had been fundamentally altered by the universal experience of abandonment and betrayal in the face of death. Part 4. Ghost Towns. The great cities of medieval Europe had been the crown jewels of human civilization, pulsing with life, commerce, and culture. These urban centers, Florence with its banking houses, London with its bustling Thameside markets, Venice with its maritime empire, represented humanity's greatest achievements in organization, architecture, and social complexity. They were places where thousands of people lived in close proximity, creating a symphony of human activity that never ceased. The calls of merchants hawking their wares, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, the laughter of children playing in narrow alleys, the chanting of monks at prayer, the hammering of craftsmen in their workshops. By the winter of 1348, the Black Death had transformed these vibrant metropolises into something that defied comprehension. Vast necropolises where silence reigned supreme, and the living moved like specters through streets that had become open-air mausoleums. The transformation was so complete and so horrifying that survivors would later struggle to convince their descendants that these ghost towns had once been among the most alive places on earth. Florence, the cradle of Renaissance, becomes a tomb. Florence, the city that would later give birth to the Renaissance, stood in 1347 as one of Europe's most prosperous and culturally sophisticated urban centers. Home to nearly 100,000 people, it buzzed with the activities of bankers, wool merchants, artists, and scholars. The Medici banking houses conducted business across Europe. Florentine textiles were prized from London to Constantinople, and the city's churches and palazzos represented the height of medieval architectural achievement. The plague reached Florence in the spring of 1348, and within 18 months, this jewel of Tuscan civilization had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing from his refuge in the hills outside the city, provided an eyewitness account that remains one of the most haunting descriptions of urban death ever recorded. Where once the Piazza della Signoria rang with the voices of merchants conducting their business and citizens debating the affairs of the Republic, Boccaccio wrote, now there exists only a terrible silence broken occasionally by the sound of cartwheels carrying the dead to mass graves outside the city walls. The great palazzo that housed our government stands nearly empty, its windows dark, its halls echoing with the footsteps of the few officials who dare still to enter. The speed of Florence's demographic collapse was staggering. By conservative estimates, the city lost between 60% and 70% of its population within 2 years. Entire neighborhoods simply emptied, their residents either dead or fled to the countryside. The once thriving Oltrarno district, home to many of the city's artisans and craftsmen, became a wasteland of abandoned workshops and silent streets. Lepo Mazzi, a notary who survived the plague years, documented his walks through the transformed city in letters to friends who have fled to safer locations. I venture today to the street of goldsmiths, where once the sound of hammers on precious metals created a constant music of industry, he wrote in late 1348. Now the workshops stand open and empty, their tools scattered on workbenches, as if their owners had simply vanished mid-task. Dust covers a half-finished jewelry, and rats scurry freely through shops that once would have been carefully guarded treasures. The psychological impact of walking through these abandoned spaces was profound. Mazzi described the eerie experience of hearing his own footsteps echoing off the walls of empty buildings, a sound that in a living city would have been completely masked by the constant buzz of human activity. The echo of my boots on the stones follows me like a ghost, he wrote, reminding me with each step that I am alone in what was once a city of thousands. Perhaps most disturbing were the abandoned palazzos of Florence's wealthy merchant families. These grand residences, which had once hosted elaborate feasts and important business meetings, stood like empty museums of interrupted lives. The Palazzo Davanzati, home to one of Florence's most important wool trading families, was found with its dining table still set for a meal that was never finished. The food long since rotted, but the silver plates and goblets still in their places, covered in dust and cobwebs. London, the Thames choked with death. London in 1348 was a city of perhaps 80,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest urban centers in northern Europe. The Thames served as the city's lifeline, bringing trade goods from across the known world to the wharves that lined its banks. The city's narrow, winding streets teemed with merchants, laborers, clerks, and nobles, creating a cacophony of languages and dialects that reflected London's position as a cosmopolitan trading hub. The plague's arrival in London created scenes of devastation that surpassed even the horrors witnessed in continental cities. The combination of London's dense population, poor sanitation, and the city's role as a major port created perfect conditions for the disease to spread with unprecedented speed and lethality. Brother Michael of Northburg, a Benedictine monk attached to Westminster Abbey, kept a chronicle of London's transformation that provides one of the most detailed accounts of an English city's death. His entries, initially concerned with routine abbey business, gradually become consumed with documenting the apocalyptic scenes unfolding outside the monastery walls. The streets near the docks, which once echoed with the calls of stevedores and the creaking of ship masts, now present a sight that would challenge the descriptive powers of Dante himself. Brother Michael wrote in September 1348, "Bodies lie where they fell, some in doorways where they sought shelter, others in the middle of thoroughfares where they collapsed while attempting to flee the city. The living, when one encounters them, move like wraiths, pressing cloth to their faces to block the stench and avoiding eye contact with their fellow survivors." The Thames itself became a repository for the dead as the city's burial capacity was overwhelmed. Bodies were loaded onto barges and dumped into the river, creating a gruesome flotilla of corpses that clogged the waterway and made navigation impossible. The tide would carry masses of decomposing bodies up and down the river, leaving them stranded on mudflats and riverbanks throughout the Thames estuary. Ralph of Shrewsbury, Bishop of Bath and Wells, visited London in late 1348 and left a harrowing account of the city's condition. The great market of Cheapside, where once merchants from across Christendom gathered to trade their goods, stands completely abandoned, he reported. Stalls that once displayed silk from China and spices from the Indies are overturned and empty. Packs of dogs roam freely through the market, and I witnessed these animals feeding upon carrion that I dare not describe in detail. The city's famous bells, which had once marked the hours and called the faithful to prayer, fell silent as the bell ringers died or fled. This absence of sound proved particularly unnerving to survivors, as the bells had provided a constant audio backdrop to London life for centuries. Brother Michael noted that the silence is more oppressive than any sound could be, for it reminds us constantly that the great heart of our city has ceased to beat. Many of London's great buildings stood completely empty. The Guildhall, seat of the city's government, was abandoned when the Lord Mayor and most of the aldermen either died or fled the city. The Tower of London maintained only a skeleton guard, and even the royal court removed itself to safer locations in the countryside. Westminster itself, the center of English royal power, became a ghost palace where a handful of clerks attempted to maintain the pretense of governance, while the kingdom effectively governed itself. Venice, the queen of the seas, becomes a floating cemetery. Venice in the 14th century represented the pinnacle of medieval maritime civilization. Built on more than 100 small islands in the Adriatic Lagoon, the city had grown wealthy and powerful through its control of trade routes between Europe and the East. Its unique geography, with canals serving as streets and ornate palazzos rising directly from the water, made it one of the most distinctive and beautiful cities in the world. The plague's arrival in Venice created a uniquely horrifying spectacle, as the city's famous waterways became clogged with corpses in numbers that defied comprehension. The very feature that made Venice distinctive, its canal system, became the instrument of its transformation into a massive floating cemetery. Doge Andrea Dandolo, Venice's elected leader, maintained detailed records of the plague's impact on the city until his own death from the disease in late 1348. His chronicles provide an official perspective on Venice's demographic collapse that is all the more chilling for its bureaucratic precision. The daily mortality reports, which our clerks dutifully maintain despite the dangers of their office, record numbers that seem to mock human comprehension, Dandolo wrote. On the worst days, we count more than 600 dead within the city's boundaries. The corpse barges, which depart from Saint Michel at dawn and return at dusk, can no longer accommodate the numbers of bodies requiring disposal. The problem of body disposal in Venice was particularly acute due to the city's unique geography. Traditional burial was limited by the small amount of available land, and the plague quickly overwhelmed the capacity of existing cemeteries. The solution was to load bodies onto barges and take them to outlying islands for mass burial. But even this system broke down as the numbers of dead exceeded the city's logistical capabilities. Marco Barbaro, a Venetian nobleman who survived the plague, described a horrifying scene in the city's canals. The smaller waterways, particularly those in the Castello district, became so clogged with floating corpses that navigation became impossible. The bodies, swollen by decomposition and buoyed by the gases of decay, created dams of death that blocked the normal flow of water. The stench was so overwhelming that even the fish died, adding their rotting forms to the grotesque spectacle. The famous gondoliers, who had served as Venice's primary means of transportation for centuries, either died or refused to work in waters contaminated by death. This created a transportation crisis that effectively divided the city into isolated islands, as residents became trapped in their own neighborhoods, without means of crossing the corpse-filled canals. The Rialto Bridge, Venice's commercial heart where merchants from across Europe had gathered for centuries to conduct business, stood completely abandoned. The markets that had once displayed goods from Constantinople, Alexandria, and London were empty save for the rats that scurried freely through the vacant stalls. Barbaro noted that the silence is broken only by the lapping of contaminated water against the stone foundations of buildings that once rang with the voices of international commerce. The universal silence. Across all these great cities, survivors consistently reported the same phenomenon, a silence so complete and unnatural that it seemed to press against the eardrums like a physical force. Cities that had never known quiet, where the sound of human activity had continued day and night for centuries, suddenly became places where a dropped coin could be heard echoing for blocks. This silence was not merely the absence of human voices, but the absence of all the secondary sounds that human activity generated. No cartwheels rumbling over cobblestones, no hammers striking anvils, no church bells marking the hours, no dogs barking, no horses neighing, no children playing. Even the rats, initially benefiting from the abundance of corpses, eventually succumbed to the plague in such numbers that their usual rustling and scratching fell silent. Pietro Azerio, a chronicler from Piacenza, attempted to capture this acoustic transformation. A city without its voices is like a body without its soul. The physical form remains, but the essence that gave it life has departed. One becomes aware of sounds that were always present but never noticed. The whisper of wind through empty streets, the drip of water from broken gutters, the creak of shutters that no one closes anymore. Abandoned lives in interrupted motion. Perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of these ghost cities was the evidence of lives suddenly interrupted. Survivors exploring abandoned buildings would find scenes that looked as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-activity. Meals half prepared in kitchens, with bread still in ovens and soup congealed in pots. Workshops with tools laid out for tasks that would never be completed. Beds unmade as if their occupants had just risen, not knowing they would never return. In Florence, the workshop of Andrea Pisano, the famous sculptor, was found with half-completed relief still mounted on his workbench, the chisel lying beside it, as if he had just set it down. In London, the scriptorium of St. Paul's Cathedral contained manuscripts that ended mid-sentence, the quill pen still lying beside the unfinished page where the scribe had left it. These frozen moments in time created a unique form of horror for survivors. The abandoned spaces were not ruins that had decayed over time, but perfect preservations of normal life suddenly interrupted by death. Walking through these spaces was like walking through a museum of interrupted humanity, where every object told a story of plans never fulfilled and lives never completed. The ecology of abandonment. As human life disappeared from these urban centers, nature began to reclaim spaces that had been dominated by human activity for centuries. Weeds sprouted from cracks in cobblestones that were no longer maintained. Vines began to creep up the walls of abandoned buildings. Wild animals, initially drawn by the abundance of carrion, began to make homes and structures that had been built for human habitation. The transformation was particularly noticeable in Venice, where the absence of boat traffic allowed marine life to flourish in canals that had been constantly disturbed for centuries. Fish returned to waterways where they had not been seen in generations, creating the bizarre spectacle of crystal-clear waters flowing past the corpse-strewn palazzos of dead merchant princes. The sound of solitude. For the few survivors who remained in these transformed cities, the experience of solitude was unlike anything in human history. These were not wilderness hermits who had chosen isolation, but people trapped in the shells of once great civilizations, surrounded by the artifacts of vanished societies, but utterly alone in their daily existence. The chronicler Giovanni da Procida, one of the few inhabitants to remain in Naples throughout the plague years, described the psychological impact of this urban solitude. I walked through streets where I once knew every shopkeeper by name, past houses where I attended christenings and weddings, through squares where I celebrated festivals with thousands of my fellow citizens. Now I am alone with the ghosts of all these memories, and the echo of my footsteps is the only sound that proves I still exist in this world of the dead. These ghost cities represented more than demographic catastrophe. They embodied the complete breakdown of human civilization itself. They were proof that the greatest achievements of medieval society, the urban centers that had represented humanity's triumph over nature and chaos, could be reduced to silence and emptiness by a microscopic enemy that recognized no human authority and respected no human achievement. The great cities of Europe had become monuments to the fragility of civilization itself, vast necropolises where the living walked among the architectural remnants of a world that had died as surely as the millions of individuals who had once filled these streets with life. Part 5. Rituals of Mass Death. For over 1,000 years, Christian Europe had maintained elaborate and sacred rituals surrounding death that served not merely as practical necessities, but as fundamental expressions of human dignity and spiritual belief. The proper burial of the dead was considered both a corporal work of mercy and a theological imperative, ensuring that the deceased would be ready for resurrection on the day of judgment. These rituals, the washing and preparation of the body, the vigil of prayer, the funeral mass, the consecrated burial in hallowed ground, represented the culmination of Christian life and the community's final act of love toward the departed. The Black Death destroyed these sacred traditions with a thoroughness that shocked medieval sensibilities more profoundly than even the massive death toll itself. By the winter of 1348, The sheer volume of corpses had rendered traditional burial practices not merely difficult, but physically impossible. What emerged in their place was a mechanized system of corpse disposal that stripped death of its dignity and transformed the sacred act of burial into something resembling the clearing of battlefield carrion, the collapse of sacred tradition. The transformation began gradually in many cities, as church authorities initially attempted to maintain proper burial practices despite the mounting numbers of dead. Father Alessandro Di Siena, keeper of records for the cathedral chapter of the city, documented the progressive breakdown of funeral rituals in meticulous detail that reveals both his dedication to proper procedure and his growing horror at the situation's deterioration. In the early days of the pestilence, Father Alessandro wrote, we maintained our sacred obligations to the dead with the same reverence we had shown for centuries. Each body was properly washed and shrouded. Each soul commended to God with the full rites of our holy church. The graveyards, though filling rapidly, could still accommodate the deceased with individual plots marked by wooden crosses or stones bearing their names. But this careful observance of tradition quickly became impossible as the daily death toll multiplied beyond anything the medieval mind could have conceived. Father Alessandro's records show the progression from individual burials to shared graves, then to mass trenches, and finally to methods that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. By the Feast of All Saints, we were placing 3 bodies in graves intended for 1, he recorded. By Christmas, we had begun digging trenches that could accommodate 20 souls. By Epiphany, we no longer counted the dead we laid to rest, for their numbers exceeded our ability to record them. The psychological impact on the clergy responsible for these rites was devastating. These men had dedicated their lives to the careful observance of sacred ritual, believing that proper ceremony was essential for the spiritual welfare of both the deceased and the community. To see these traditions collapse felt like a fundamental betrayal of their vocational calling. Brother Thomas of Eccleston, a Franciscan who worked in London's overwhelmed cemeteries, left a confession that reveals the spiritual crisis experienced by many religious who witnessed the breakdown of sacred burial practices. I entered this order believing that I would serve God by ministering to souls in their most sacred moments. Instead, I have become a laborer who handles corpses like sacks of grain, stacking them in pits with no more ceremony than a farmer burying diseased cattle. Mass graves, the geometry of death. As traditional burial became impossible, European cities began implementing mass burial systems that transformed the very landscape of death. The careful individual plots of medieval cemeteries, each marked with crosses and surrounded by prayers, gave way to enormous excavations that resembled mining operations more than sacred burial grounds. The mass graves dug during the plague years were marvels of grim efficiency, engineered to accommodate hundreds or even thousands of bodies in configurations that maximized space while minimizing the labor required for their creation. These pits, typically rectangular and excavated at depths of 15 or 20 feet, represented a complete abandonment of the Christian principle that each soul deserved individual recognition in death. Giovanni Morelli, a Florentine chronicler who supervised several mass burial operations, provided detailed descriptions of these excavations that read like architectural plans for monuments to despair. We dig trenches 60 feet in length and 30 feet in width, arranged in rows like the furrows of some infernal field. The bodies are placed in layers, each layer separated by a thin coating of lime to hasten decomposition and reduce the stench. 20 bodies per layer, 5 layers deep, 1,000 souls in each excavation, buried together without regard for their names, their families, or their stations in life. The process of filling these mass graves followed procedures that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with construction or agricultural work, but applied to human remains created a horror that defied comprehension. Bodies were transported to the burial sites in carts, like produce being taken to market, then unloaded and arranged with the mechanical precision of workers stacking lumber. Agnolo di Terra, a Sienese chronicler who worked in his city's mass burial operations, described the systematic dehumanization that this process required. We learn to think of them not as Giovanni the baker or Maria the seamstress, but simply as cargo to be efficiently stored. This mental transformation was necessary for our sanity, but it felt like we were committing a sin against their very souls by reducing them to mere objects occupying space. The speed required for these operations meant that mistakes were inevitable and horrifying. Bodies that showed faint signs of life were sometimes included with the dead, as the workers lacked time for careful examination. Agnolo di Tura recorded the nightmarish possibility that haunted all who worked in the burial pits. In our haste, we may have buried some who were not yet dead, but merely unconscious from the fever. The thought that they might awaken in the darkness beneath tons of corpses and earth is a horror that visits my dreams every night. Funeral pyres, the burning cities. In some cities, the logistics of mass burial proved so overwhelming that authorities turned cremation, a practice that was not only forbidden by Christian doctrine, but was associated with pagan antiquity and considered an abomination by medieval standards. The decision to burn the dead represented perhaps the most complete abandonment of Christian burial practices, but the sheer volume of corpses left city officials with no alternative. The first funeral pyres were constructed with some attempt to maintain dignity, using procedures adapted from the cremation of animals during livestock epidemics. But as the death toll mounted, these fires evolved into industrial operations that burned continuously for months, consuming human remains with the mechanical efficiency of furnaces. Michel de Piazza, who witnessed construction of Messina's first great funeral pyre, described a horrifying spectacle. They built it in the square before the cathedral, using timbers taken from demolished houses and oil pressed from the lamps of abandoned churches. The pyre rose 20 feet into the air, a structure large enough to consume hundreds of bodies at once. When lit, it created a column of smoke so thick and black that it blocked the sun and cast the entire city into an artificial twilight. The psychological impact of these constantly burning pyres was profound. The smoke carried not just the smell of burning wood, but the sweet, nauseating odor of burning human flesh that penetrated every building and clung to every piece of clothing. Citizens reported that the smell was so pervasive that food began to taste of death, and many survivors lost the ability to eat normal meals for months after the fires were finally extinguished. Perhaps most disturbing was the sound produced by these mass cremations. As bodies burned, the heat would cause muscles to contract and bones to crack, creating noises that witnesses consistently described as resembling screams or moans. Many citizens became convinced that the fires were somehow torturing the souls of the dead, adding a layer of theological horror to the practical necessity of disposing of corpses. Antonio Pucci, a Florentine poet who lived near one of the city's great funeral pyres, captured the auditory nightmare in verses that became widely circulated among survivors. Day and night the fires consume our dead, slash, and from their flames arise sounds of dread slash that might be wind through burning wood, slash, or might be cries from where souls once stood. The corpse bearers, merchants of death. As traditional burial systems collapsed, a new profession emerged that embodied the complete transformation of death from sacred ritual to commercial transaction. The corpse bearers, known by various names across Europe, Spazzini in Italy, rakers in England, fossoyeurs in France, became among the highest paid workers of the plague years, commanding wages that reflected both the danger of their work and society's desperate need for their services. These men, typically drawn from the poorest and most desperate segments of society, developed systematic methods for collecting, transporting, and disposing of bodies that transformed death into an industrial process. They worked in teams, using specialized equipment, carts with removable sides for easy loading, hooks for handling bodies without direct contact, masks soaked in aromatic herbs to reduce the stench that turned corpse removal into a skilled trade. Marchione di Capo Stefani, a Florentine chronicler, provided detailed descriptions of these death merchants at work. They arrive at dawn with their carts, calling out for bodies as other merchants might call for rags or scrap metal. Families who can afford their fees pay to have their dead removed with some semblance of care. Those who cannot pay must drag their deceased to designated collection points, where the bodies are loaded like cargo and transported to the burial grounds. The corpse bearers developed their own culture and traditions that reflected their unique relationship with death. They formed guilds at regulated prices and territories, maintained their own taverns where outsiders were not welcome, and created ritualistic drinking songs that helped them psychologically process the horror of their daily work. Giovanni Boccaccio recorded some of these macabre songs, noting that the corpse bearers sang while they worked, not hymns of mourning, but drinking songs and tales of earthly pleasures, as if surrounding themselves with celebrations of life could protect them from the death they handled so intimately. The moral ambiguity of these men troubled medieval society profoundly. They were simultaneously essential workers who performed necessary services and pariahs who had chosen to profit from humanity's greatest catastrophe. Many citizens viewed them as ghouls who fed on misery, while others recognized them as heroes who willingly faced death to serve the living. The mechanics of disposal. The transformation of death from sacred ritual to mechanical process required the development of new technologies and procedures that would have been unthinkable in normal times. Cities established corpse collection schedules with designated pickup points, created standardized pricing for body removal, and developed quality control systems to ensure efficient disposal of remains. The city of Venice, with its unique geography, developed perhaps the most systematic approach to mass death management. The government established a fleet of specialized barges designed specifically for corpse transport, with crews trained in efficient loading and unloading procedures. These death barges made scheduled runs between collection points throughout the city and the outlying islands where mass graves had been excavated. Pietro Bembo, a Venetian official who supervised the system, documented the bureaucratic precision that mass death required. Each barge carries a manifest listing the number of bodies collected from each district, the estimated weight of the cargo, and the designated burial site. Our clerks maintain careful records of capacity and scheduling to ensure that no district's dead remain uncollected for more than 2 days. This bureaucratization of death created its own form of horror, as human beings were reduced to statistics in ledgers and items in shipping manifests. The careful record-keeping that had once documented baptisms, marriages, and individual deaths now tracked only tonnage and transportation logistics. The desecration of sacred space. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the mass death rituals was how they transformed sacred spaces into industrial facilities. Churchyards that had been places of quiet contemplation and prayer became excavation sites resembling construction zones. Cathedrals were used as temporary storage facilities for bodies awaiting disposal. Monasteries became corpse processing centers where monks worked alongside laborers to prepare bodies for mass burial. The Abbey of St. Denis near Paris, traditional burial place of French royalty, was converted into a corpse sorting facility where bodies were categorized by size and condition to maximize efficiency in mass grave arrangement. Brother Michel, one of the few monks who remained at the abbey throughout the plague years, described the transformation. The nave where kings once lay in state now houses hundreds of common corpses arranged in rows like merchandise in a warehouse. The altar where we once celebrated the resurrection has become a desk where clerks record the daily tallies of the dead. This desecration of sacred space created a theological crisis that extended far beyond practical concerns. If churches could be converted into corpse processing facilities, if holy ground could be excavated from mass graves, if the bodies of the faithful could be burned like refuse, what did this say about the nature of sacred space and the promise of resurrection? The end of individual identity. Perhaps the most profound transformation wrought by the mass death rituals was a complete elimination of individual identity in death. Traditional Christian burial had emphasized that each soul was precious to God and deserving of individual recognition. Names were recorded in parish registers, graves were marked with crosses or stones, and families maintained specific burial plots where they could return to remember their deceased. The mass death systems of the plague years made such individual recognition impossible. Bodies lost their names when they entered the collection system, becoming simply units of organic matter to be efficiently processed and disposed of. Families often had no idea where their loved ones had been buried, as mass graves were typically unmarked and their locations kept secret to prevent relatives from attempting to recover specific remains. This anonymity in death represented perhaps the most complete victory of the plague over medieval Christian civilization. The disease had not merely killed millions of individuals. It had destroyed the very concept of individual dignity in death, reducing human beings to anonymous components in a vast industrial process of disposal. The persistence of horror. The mass death rituals of the plague years left psychological scars on survivors that persisted long after the disease had run its course. Those who had worked in the death industry, corpse bearers, grave diggers, pyre tenders, body sorters, often found themselves unable to return to normal life, haunted by memories of the mechanical processing of human remains. Many survivors reported nightmares about mass graves opening and disgorging their contents, or about being buried alive in the anonymous pits that had swallowed so many of their contemporaries. The transformation of death from sacred ritual to industrial process had fundamentally altered European attitudes toward mortality, creating a cultural trauma that would influence art, literature, and religious practice for generations. The Black Death had accomplished more than demographic catastrophe. It had destroyed the medieval Christian understanding of death as a sacred transition deserving of ritual recognition and individual dignity. In its place, it had created a mechanized system of corpse disposal that reduced human beings to anonymous units in a vast accounting of mortality. Death itself had been stripped of its dignity, and with it, much of what medieval society believed about the sacred nature of human existence. Part 6. The Flagellants' Religious Terror. In the summer of 1348, as the Black Death reached its devastating peak across Europe, a new horror emerged that in many ways proved more psychologically disturbing than the plague itself. From the hills of Bavaria came reports of strange processions, hundreds of men and women marching through villages and towns, their backs bloody from self-inflicted wounds, their voices raised in haunting lamentations that spoke of divine wrath and the necessity of suffering. These were the Flagellants, and their movement would transform medieval Christianity into something that resembled a theater of collective madness more than organized religion. The Flagellant movement represented religion stripped of all comfort and hope, reduced to its most primitive elements of fear, guilt, and the desperate human need to believe that suffering could somehow purchase salvation. What began as isolated groups of penitents seeking divine mercy through self-punishment evolved into a continent-wide phenomenon that created its own form of contagion. Not bacterial, but psychological and spiritual, spreading through communities with the same inexorable force as the plague itself. The theology of pain. The intellectual foundation of the Flagellant movement lay in a radical interpretation of medieval Christian theology that transformed suffering from a consequence of sin into the primary means of salvation. Traditional Christian doctrine taught that Christ's suffering on the cross had redeemed humanity, making additional human suffering unnecessary for salvation. The Flagellants inverted this comfortable theology, arguing that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, and that only through matching Christ's physical agony could Christians hope to appease an angry God. Brother Conrad of Megenberg, a Dominican monk who initially sympathized with the movement before recognizing its dangers, documented the theological reasoning that drove thousands to embrace ritualized self-torture. They preached that the pestilence is God's scourge upon a sinful world, sent to purify the earth through suffering as Noah's flood once purified it through water. They claimed that only by shedding their own blood in imitation of Christ's passion can Christians demonstrate sufficient repentance to end this divine punishment. This theology of pain found fertile ground in a population already traumatized by the unprecedented suffering they had witnessed. The plague had killed indiscriminately, the pious along with the sinful, children along with adults, clergy along with lay people. Traditional Christian explanations for suffering, that the righteous would be protected and the wicked punished, had been rendered meaningless by a disease that seemed to mock moral distinctions. The Flagellants offered a different explanation. The plague was not random but purposeful, a test that required active participation through voluntary suffering. This message provided psychological relief to people desperate to believe that their world had not descended into meaningless chaos, but was instead following some divine plan that human action could influence. Master Johann of Winterthur, a chronicler who witnessed a movement's early development in the German states, described the appeal of this theology. In a world where prayer seemed powerless and virtue offered no protection, the Flagellants promised that suffering, the one thing everyone could control, was the key to salvation. People who felt helpless against the plague could at least choose their own pain. The ritual of blood. The Flagellant ceremonies combined elements of Christian liturgy with practices that bordered on pre-Christian blood sacrifice, creating spectacles that simultaneously fascinated and horrified medieval audiences. These rituals followed carefully prescribed forms that transformed self-torture into elaborate religious theater performed in public spaces for maximum psychological impact. A typical Flagellant procession would enter a town in formation, led by a master who carried a large wooden cross and set the rhythm for the ritual. The participants, numbering anywhere from 50 to several hundred, would be arranged in specific patterns that reflected their spiritual hierarchy within the movement. All wore identical costumes, white robes marked with red crosses, hoods that covered their faces, and broad-brimmed hats that gave them a ghostly, otherworldly appearance. The procession would make its way to the town's central square or church courtyard, where the participants would arrange themselves in a large circle. At a signal from their leader, they would remove their outer garments, revealing backs already scarred from previous ceremonies. Then, to the accompaniment of hymns and prayers, they would begin the central ritual of their faith, the systematic laceration of their own flesh with specially designed whips. These scourges were not simple whips, but carefully crafted instruments of torture. Heinrich of Herford, a chronicler who observed numerous flagellant ceremonies, provided detailed descriptions of these implements. Their scourges are made of leather thongs embedded with iron spikes and sharp pieces of metal. Some attach small knives to the ends of the straps. Others use chains fitted with iron stars that tear the flesh with each blow. The blood flows so freely that it pools on the ground beneath them and spatters the spectators who press close to witness their devotion. The flagellants would maintain the self-torture for precisely 33½ minutes, representing the years of Christ's earthly life, while singing hymns that grew increasingly frenzied as pain and blood loss affected their mental state. The combination of rhythmic movement, physical agony, and group chanting created altered states of consciousness that participants described as direct communion with the divine. Brother Berthold of Regensburg, initially drawn to join the movement, described the psychological transformation that occurred during these rituals. The pain begins as fire consuming your back, but as you continue to strike yourself and hear the voices of your brothers raise and praise, the agony becomes something else, a doorway through which you pass into the presence of God Himself. The blood that flows from your wounds becomes the blood of Christ, and your suffering merges with His suffering until you are no longer yourself but part of something eternal and sacred. The contagion of hysteria. The flagellant movement spread across Europe with a speed that rivaled the plague itself, but its transmission followed psychological rather than biological pathways. Witnesses to flagellant ceremonies often reported an overwhelming compulsion to join the ritual, as the spectacle of voluntary suffering created its own form of contagion that infected observers through their eyes and ears rather than their lungs. The movement spread followed the same trade routes and pilgrimage paths that had carried the plague, but its carriers were not merchants or travelers but the flagellants themselves, who moved in organized bands from town to town, performing their rituals and recruiting new members from local populations. Each performance created converts who would form new groups or join existing processions, creating an exponential growth that church and secular authorities found impossible to control. Matthias of Neuburg, a German chronicler, documented the movement's explosive growth in his region. They arrived in our town as a band of perhaps 60 souls, strangers from distant lands whose German was heavily accented and whose customs seemed foreign to our eyes. But when they departed 3 days later, they had grown to more than 200, including men and women we had known since childhood. Shopkeepers, farmers, even minor clergy who abandoned their parishes to follow these prophets of pain. The conversion process often occurred with startling suddenness. Observers would watch flagellant ceremonies with varying degrees of skepticism, curiosity, or horror, only to find themselves overwhelmed by an inexplicable compulsion to participate. The combination of psychological trauma from plague, religious hysteria, and the powerful spectacle of mass self-torture created conditions ripe for collective psychological breakdown. Agnes of Bohemia, a noble woman who witnessed a flagellant ceremony in Prague, described her own near conversion. I attended their ritual with the intention of exposing their heresy to proper church authorities. But as I watched them bleeding for their sins while my own family lay dead from the pestilence, I found myself questioning why I deserved to live when so many had died. The urge to join them, to shed my own blood in payment for my survival, became so overwhelming that I had to flee the square lest I abandon my station and my reason together. Masters of pain. The flagellant movement developed its own leadership structure that paralleled and competed with established church hierarchy. These leaders, known as masters, claimed direct divine inspiration and positioned themselves as prophets who could interpret God's word regarding the plague and humanity's proper response to divine wrath. The most influential of these masters was a German peasant named Konrad Schmid, who claimed to have received visions directly from Christ instructing him to organize processions of penitents to appease divine anger. Schmid's followers believed he possessed supernatural powers, including the ability to heal through touch and prophesy when the plague would end in specific locations. Brother Friedrich of Goslar, who infiltrated Schmid's following to investigate the movement for church authorities, provided detailed accounts of the master's methods. He claims that an angel appeared to him in a vision, bearing a letter written in Christ's own blood commanding all Christians to scourge themselves for 33 days. He carries what he claims is a copy of this heavenly letter, written on parchment stained with what appears to be blood, though whether human or animal I cannot say. These masters wielded enormous psychological power over their followers, who viewed them as divinely appointed leaders capable of mediating between humanity and an angry God. They established elaborate rules governing flagellant behavior, created hierarchies within their groups, and developed doctrines that increasingly diverged from Orthodox Christian teaching. The authority claimed by these leaders often extended beyond spiritual matters into temporal concerns. They declared that participation in their rituals provided more spiritual benefit than receiving the sacraments from ordained priests, that their blood-soaked ceremonies were more pleasing to God than traditional religious observances, and that their groups constituted a new form of church that superseded established religious institutions. The theater of suffering. Flagellant ceremonies evolved into elaborate theatrical productions that combined religious ritual with public entertainment, creating spectacles that drew enormous crowds and generated intense emotional responses. These performances were carefully choreographed to maximize their psychological impact, using techniques that anticipated later developments in crowd psychology and mass media. The timing of ceremonies was crucial to their effectiveness. Flagellants typically performed their rituals during traditional religious festivals or market days, when large crowds would be present. They would arrive in towns announced by advance messengers who spread word of their coming, building anticipation and ensuring maximum attendance for their performances. The visual elements of these ceremonies were carefully designed to create maximum psychological impact. The identical white robes created an impression of supernatural uniformity, while the red crosses marked the performers as soldiers in a holy war against sin. The removal of outer garments to reveal scarred and bleeding backs created a shocking visual contrast that emphasized the reality of their self-inflicted wounds. Master Wilhelm of Cologne, who organized flagellant processions throughout the Rhineland, developed increasingly sophisticated ceremonial techniques. We begin our ritual in silence, allowing the crowd to hear only the sound of leather against flesh and the involuntary gasps of pain from our brothers. Then, as the blood begins to flow more freely, we raise our voices in hymns of lamentation that speak of humanity's sin and God's righteous anger. Finally, as our ecstasy reaches its peak, we cry out prophecies and promises of salvation for those who join us in our holy suffering. The acoustic elements of these ceremonies proved as important as the visual spectacle. The rhythmic sound of scourges striking flesh created a hypnotic effect that was enhanced by the participants' increasingly frenzied chanting. Many observers reported that the combination of sounds, the whistle of whips through air, the wet impact of leather on flesh, the growing intensity of religious songs, created an almost hallucinogenic audio environment that made rational thought difficult. The recruitment of despair. The flagellant movement proved particularly effective at recruiting individuals who had suffered severe psychological trauma from the plague. People who had watched their families die, who had survived when others perished, or who felt guilt about their inability to help plague victims found in the movement's theology of paying a way to process their survivors' guilt and trauma. The movement offered these damaged souls something that traditional Christianity seemed unable to provide, a way to actively participate in their own salvation rather than passively accepting God's will. In a world where prayer appeared powerless and virtue offered no protection, the promise that voluntary suffering could influence divine judgment provided a sense of agency to people who felt completely helpless. Sister Mechthod of Magdeburg, who counseled plague survivors in her convent, documented the psychological appeal of the flagellant message. They come to us bearing wounds both physical and spiritual, seeking understanding of why they survived when others died. Traditional consolations about God's mysterious will provide little comfort to those who have watched their children die despite their prayers. The flagellants offer something different. The promise that their survival can be justified through self-inflicted pain, that their guilt can be expiated through voluntary suffering. The movement's recruitment strategy specifically targeted individuals in psychological crisis. Flagellant preachers would seek out plague survivors, particularly those who had lost family members, and present the movement's theology as an explanation for their suffering and a path toward redemption. They argued that survivors had been spared not by chance, but by divine will, chosen to participate in humanity's collective penance for sin. The escalation of extremism. As the flagellant movement grew in size and influence, its practices became increasingly extreme and its theology more radical. What had begun as public penance evolved into something that resembled blood sacrifice more than Christian worship. Competition between different flagellant groups led to escalating displays of self-torture as each tried to demonstrate superior devotion through more spectacular suffering. Some groups began incorporating elements that clearly crossed a line from penance into sadistic ritual. They developed new forms of scourges designed to inflict more dramatic wounds, extended their ceremonies beyond the traditional 33½ minutes, and began targeting specific body parts for mutilation. Report emerged of flagellants who had permanently disfigured themselves through repeated self-torture, who bore scars that covered their entire backs and arms, or who had lost fingers or other body parts to their increasingly extreme practices. Johannes of Winterthur documented the movement's slide toward extremism. What began as imitation of Christ's passion has become something that would horrify Christ himself. I have seen flagellants whose backs are so scarred that no healthy flesh remains, whose arms are crisscrossed with wounds that never heal because they are reopened daily. Some have taken to wearing hair shirts embedded with iron spikes that cut into their flesh with every movement. Others fast for weeks at a time while continuing their daily scourging, reducing themselves to living skeletons whose bones show clearly beneath their torn skin. The corruption of children. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the flagellant movement was its recruitment of children, who were particularly susceptible to the psychological manipulation employed by the masters. Children who had been traumatized by witnessing plague deaths or who had been orphaned by the disease found in the movement a substitute family structure that promised to give meaning to their suffering. The inclusion of children in flagellant ceremonies created scenes that horrified even hardened observers. These young participants, some as young as 7 or 8 years old, would attempt to match the self-torture of adult members, often inflicting severe injuries on their small bodies, while crying out in pain and religious ecstasy. Brother Matteo of Pisa, who witnessed children participating in flagellant rituals, provided an account that reveals the depth of the movement's psychological corruption. I saw children whose bodies bore the marks of repeated scourging, whose small backs were crisscrossed with scars that spoke of weeks or months of daily self-torture. They sang the same hymns as the adults, struck themselves with the same instruments, and displayed the same religious fervor. But their eyes held a vacancy that spoke of minds broken by experiences no child should endure. The flagellant masters justified the inclusion of children by arguing that innocence provided no protection against divine wrath, as demonstrated by the plague's indiscriminate killing of young and old alike. They claimed that children's suffering was particularly pleasing to God because it was freely chosen rather than imposed by disease, and that young participants would be specially blessed for their voluntary sacrifice. The dance of death made real. The flagellant movement transformed the medieval artistic concept of the dance of death from metaphor into literal reality. The dance of death, a popular artistic theme that depicted death as a dancer who partnered with people from all walks of life, had traditionally served as a reminder of mortality's universality. The flagellants made this metaphor literal, creating processions where participants danced their own deaths through voluntary suffering. These ritualized dances of self-destruction proved mesmerizing to audiences who recognized in them a physical manifestation of their own psychological state. The plague had already made death a constant companion for all Europeans. The flagellants offered a way to dance with that companion on their own terms rather than waiting passively for disease to claim them. The psychological power of this literalized dance of death cannot be overstated. In a world where death had become random and meaningless, the flagellants created a context where death, or at least the approach to death through severe self-injury, became meaningful and voluntary. This transformation of passive victimhood into active participation provided psychological relief that proved more powerful than rational argument or religious consolation. The second contagion. By the autumn of 1348, the flagellant movement had created what contemporary observers recognized as a second epidemic. Not a disease, but a collective madness that spread through the same populations already devastated by plague. This psychological contagion proved in many ways more disturbing than the Black Death itself, because it demonstrated humanity's capacity for self-destruction even in the absence of external threats. The movement had successfully transformed medieval Christianity from a religion of hope and salvation into a cult of pain and despair. It had converted the central Christian message, that Christ's suffering had redeemed humanity, into a demand for continuous human suffering as the price of survival. Most disturbing of all, it had made this transformation appear not just reasonable but necessary, creating a theological framework that justified and sanctified the most extreme forms of self-destruction. The flagellants represented more than a religious movement. They embodied a complete psychological breakdown of medieval civilization under the pressure of unprecedented trauma. They transformed religion itself into a form of contagion, spreading despair and extremism through populations already devastated by disease and social collapse. In their bloody processions and ritualized self-torture, medieval Europe confronted not just the death of bodies, but the death of the human spirit itself. Part 7. The Hunt for Scapegoats. The Black Death did more than kill bodies. It revealed a capacity for evil that lay dormant within medieval European society, waiting for the right conditions to emerge in all its hideous fury. As the plague ravaged communities across the continent, terrorized populations began searching desperately for someone to blame, someone whose punishment might end their suffering and restore their shattered sense of divine justice. What emerged from the psychological need was a wave of persecution so systematic and brutal that it would leave scars on European consciousness for centuries to come. The hunt for scapegoats represented humanity at its absolute worst, transforming neighbors into executioners and communities into lynch mobs driven by a toxic combination of fear, hatred, and a desperate need to believe that human action could somehow control forces beyond human comprehension. The plague had created a world where rational explanation failed, where prayer seemed powerless, and where traditional authorities offered no protection. In such circumstances, the primitive human impulse to blame the other for inexplicable catastrophe reasserted itself with terrifying intensity. The architecture of accusation. The scapegoating that accompanied the Black Death followed patterns that revealed the deep-seated prejudices and social tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of medieval society for generations. The accusations did not arise randomly, but targeted specific groups who were already marginalized, already viewed with suspicion, already positioned outside the boundaries of full community membership. Jews, as the most visible religious minority in Christian Europe, bore the brunt of these accusations. Their separate religious practices, their concentration in certain professions, and their status as perpetual foreigners in Christian lands made them perfect targets for populations seeking someone to blame for their suffering. The accusation that would destroy entire Jewish communities across Europe was both simple and diabolical. The Jews had poisoned the wells, deliberately spreading the plague to destroy Christian civilization. Brother Heinrich of Herford, a Dominican chronicler who witnessed the persecution of Jews in the Rhineland, documented the logic that drove these accusations. The people reasoned thus: the pestilence strikes Christians and spares Jews, therefore the Jews must be its cause. They observed that Jewish communities seem less affected by the plague, and conclude that this can only be because the Jews possess knowledge of the poison they have introduced into our water supplies. This reasoning, though completely false, contained just enough apparent logic to convince terrorized populations already predisposed to anti-Jewish sentiment. In reality, Jewish communities were not spared by the plague. They died at the same rates as their Christian neighbors. But confirmation bias, desperation, and centuries of anti-Semitic conditioning created a perfect storm of accusation that would lead to some of the most horrific massacres in medieval history. The well-poisoning accusation was particularly effective because it provided a concrete, comprehensible explanation for an incomprehensible catastrophe. Rather than accepting that the plague was beyond human control or understanding, communities could believe that it was a result of a deliberate conspiracy that could be defeated through the identification and elimination of conspirators. The Strasbourg Massacre, a template for horror. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death reached its most systematic and horrifying expression in the massacre at Strasbourg on February 14, 1349. St. Valentine's Day transformed into a day of mass murder that would echo through history as one of medieval Europe's most shameful episodes. The Strasbourg massacre was not a spontaneous outburst of mob violence, but carefully planned operation supported by city authorities and blessed by religious leaders. The city council, under pressure from guild members who coveted Jewish property and sought to eliminate business competition, voted to arrest all Jews in the city on charges of well poisoning despite having no evidence to support these accusations. Jacob von Königshofen, a contemporary chronicler, provided a detailed account of the massacre that reveals both its systematic nature and the complete abandonment of moral restraint that characterized these persecutions. On the morning of St. Valentine's Day, the city guard went from house to house in the Jewish quarter, seizing every man, woman, and child they found. The Jews were taken to the cemetery outside the city walls, where a great wooden platform had been constructed for their execution. Those who agreed to convert to Christianity were spared, but fewer than a dozen chose apostasy over death. The method of execution chosen for Strasbourg Jews was particularly horrific: mass burning that transformed execution into public spectacle. The wooden platform was doused with oil and set alight while the victims were still bound upon it, creating a funeral pyre that could be seen for miles across the Alsatian countryside. Contemporary accounts describe the sound of the victims' screams carrying across the city, mixing with the cheers of the assembled crowd to create a cacophony that witnesses said resembled the sounds of hell itself. Perhaps most disturbing was the carnival atmosphere that surrounded these mass executions. The burning of the Jews became a public festival, with vendors selling food and drink to spectators who came to watch the slaughter as if attending a fair. Children were brought to witness the executions as a form of religious education, taught that they were seeing divine justice enacted against enemies of the faith. The aftermath of the Strasbourg massacre revealed the economic motivations that often drove these persecutions. Jewish property was seized by the city government and distributed among Christian citizens. Jewish houses were looted and burned, and Jewish businesses were taken over by their former competitors. The synagogue was converted into a church, and the Jewish cemetery was plowed under and converted to agricultural land. The contagion of hatred. The Strasbourg massacre became a template that was repeated across Europe as news of the persecution spread along the same trade routes that had carried the plague. Each massacre seemed to inspire others, creating a contagion of hatred that proved as virulent and deadly as the disease itself. In the German states, entire Jewish communities were wiped out in a wave of persecution that swept from the Rhine to the Danube. The cities of Mainz, Cologne, Frankfurt, and dozens of smaller towns witnessed scenes similar to Strasbourg, with Jewish populations either massacred outright or given a choice between conversion and death. Those who chose conversion often found that their new Christian status provided only temporary protection, as suspicion and hatred ran too deep to be easily overcome. The chronicler Johannes of Winterthur documented the spread of anti-Jewish violence across the German territories. The persecution spreads like wildfire from city to city, each community seeking to outdo its neighbors in the thoroughness of its cleansing. Where one town burns its Jews, the next feels compelled to burn theirs as well, lest they be seen as harboring enemies of the faith. The roads are filled with refugees fleeing westward, but they find that news of their coming has preceded them, and each city they approach has already closed its gates against them. The psychological mechanisms that drove this contagion of hatred were complex but understandable. Communities that had witnessed or heard about Jewish massacres in neighboring areas found themselves under pressure to take similar action, lest they be accused of complicity with the supposed well poisoners. The mass persecution created its own momentum, as each new massacre seemed to validate the accusations and justify further violence. Beyond the Jews, the expansion of scapegoating. While Jews bore the primary brunt of scapegoating during the Black Death, the logic of persecution soon expanded to encompass other marginalized groups. Lepers, who were already viewed with fear and suspicion due to their disease, found themselves accused of working in alliance with Jews to spread the plague through poisoned water supplies. The persecution of lepers followed patterns similar to anti-Jewish violence, but was complicated by the fact that leprosy itself was already understood to be contagious. This made accusations against lepers seem more plausible to medieval minds, as they could be portrayed as using their existing disease as a weapon against healthy populations. In southern France, entire leper colonies were attacked and burned by mobs convinced that these institutions were centers of anti-Christian conspiracy. The leper house at Perigueux was surrounded by an armed crowd that demanded the inmates confess to their role in spreading the plague. When the lepers denied any involvement, they were dragged from their quarters and burned alive in their own chapel. Foreign merchants and travelers also found themselves targets of suspicion and violence. Anyone whose appearance, language, or customs marked them as outsiders could become a target for communities seeking someone to blame for their suffering. Italian merchants in French cities, German traders in Polish towns, and pilgrims from distant lands all found themselves accused of carrying the plague deliberately from place to place. The persecution of foreigners revealed the xenophobic undercurrents that ran through medieval European society. In normal times, these prejudices were held in check by the practical benefits of trade and cultural exchange. But the terror of the plague stripped away these civilized restraints, allowing pure tribal hatred to express itself through organized violence. Women as scapegoats, the birth of witch hunts. The Black Death period also witnessed some of the earliest systematic persecutions of women accused of witchcraft, establishing patterns that would culminate in the great witch hunts of the later medieval and early modern periods. Women, particularly those who were elderly, widowed, or otherwise marginalized, found themselves accused of using supernatural powers to spread disease and cause death. The accusation of witchcraft provided a perfect explanation for the plague's seemingly supernatural characteristics. Its ability to strike without warning, its resistance to traditional medical treatments, and its apparent randomness in choosing victims. If the disease was caused by supernatural malevolence rather than natural causes, then supernatural enemies must be responsible for its spread. Agnes Bernauer, a wise woman who practiced folk medicine in a Bavarian village, became one of the first documented victims of plague-era witch persecution. Local authorities arrested her after several plague deaths occurred among people she had treated with herbal remedies. Under torture, she confessed to making a pact with Satan to spread disease through her medications, and was burned at the stake before a crowd that included many people she had previously helped with her healing arts. The persecution of alleged witches during the plague years established legal and theological precedents that would later justify centuries of witch hunting. The techniques of interrogation, the types of evidence considered valid, and the methods of execution developed during this period became standard procedures that would claim thousands of lives in subsequent generations. The economics of persecution. Beneath the religious and psychological motivations for scapegoating lay powerful economic incentives that often provided the real driving force behind persecution. The seizure of Jewish property, in particular, provided enormous financial benefits to both individual persecutors and municipal governments struggling with the economic disruption caused by the plague. The confiscation of Jewish assets was typically justified as punishment for their alleged crimes, but the distribution of these assets revealed the true motivations behind many persecutions. Jewish houses were sold to Christian buyers at below market prices, Jewish businesses were transferred to Christian competitors, and Jewish debts were often declared void, providing immediate financial relief to Christian debtors. Master Johann of Basel, a city treasurer who kept detailed records of assets seized during the persecution of his city's Jewish community, documented the enormous wealth that changed hands. The seizure of Jewish property had provided the city treasury with gold and silver valued at more than 12,000 marks, along with houses and commercial properties worth perhaps twice that amount. The distribution of these assets among Christian citizens has provided relief from the economic hardships caused by the pestilence. This economic dimension of persecution created additional incentives for violence, as individuals and communities discovered that accusations of well poisoning could be financially profitable. The combination of religious hatred, psychological scapegoating, and economic opportunism created a perfect storm of persecution that swept across Europe with devastating effect. The collapse of moral authority. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the scapegoating that accompanied the Black Death was a complete failure of moral and religious authorities to prevent or even condemn these atrocities. Pope Clement VI did issue a papal bull in 1348 pointing out that Jews were dying from the plague at the same rates as Christians and therefore could not be responsible for its spread. But this official condemnation had little effect on local persecutions. Many local clergy actively participated in or supported the persecution of Jews and other scapegoats, blessing the massacres and providing theological justification for mass murder. The parish priest of Strasbourg blessed the platform where Jews were burned alive, and similar clerical support was provided for persecutions across Europe. This clerical complicity in mass murder represented a complete abandonment of Christian moral teaching and revealed the depth to which fear and hatred had corrupted medieval religious institutions. The very authorities who should have provided moral leadership in times of crisis instead became instruments of persecution and violence. Brother Berthold of Regensburg, one of the few clerics who spoke out against the persecutions, documented the moral collapse of his fellow religious. I have seen priests who should be preaching Christ's message of love instead blessing the instruments of torture used against innocent Jews. I have heard sermons that transform murder into holy work and hatred into divine service. The plague has infected not just our bodies but our souls, turning servant of God into ministers of Satan. The children of hatred. One of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the scapegoating was the involvement of children as both witnesses and participants in mass violence. Children were brought to watch executions, encouraged to throw stones at victims, and taught that persecution of scapegoats was a form of religious duty. The psychological damage inflicted on these child witnesses was profound and lasting. Many would carry traumatic memories of mass violence for the rest of their lives, while others would be conditioned to view persecution and murder as normal and acceptable responses to crisis. Young Heinrich of Augsburg, who witnessed the burning of a city's Jewish community as a 7-year-old child, later wrote about the experience as an adult. I remember the sounds more than the sights, the screaming of the victims mixing with the cheers of the crowd, the crackling of flames consuming human flesh, the laughter of children who had been taught that this horror was a form of divine justice. These sounds have echoed in my nightmares for 30 years, reminding me of what human beings are capable when fear overcomes reason. The legacy of scapegoating. The persecutions that accompanied the Black Death left permanent scars on European society that would influence attitudes toward minorities and outsiders for centuries to come. The techniques of mass persecution developed during this period, the use of torture to extract confessions, the seizure of victims' property, the involvement of religious authorities in justifying violence, became standard tools of oppression that would be employed against various groups throughout European history. The destruction of Jewish communities was particularly devastating, as it eliminated centuries of cultural and intellectual development that could never be recovered. Entire libraries of Hebrew manuscripts were burned along with their owners, centers of learning were destroyed, and traditions of scholarship and commerce were interrupted in ways that impoverished European civilization as a whole. The Black Death had revealed that beneath the veneer of medieval Christian civilization lay primitive impulses toward tribal violence and scapegoating that could be activated by sufficient fear and desperation. The plague did not create these impulses, but it stripped away the social and moral restraints that normally kept them in check, allowing European society to glimpse its own capacity for evil. The hunt for scapegoats during the plague years demonstrated that human beings, when sufficiently terrorized, were capable of abandoning every principle of justice, mercy, and human dignity in favor of primitive blood, revenge against innocent victims. This revelation about human nature proved as devastating as the disease itself, leaving survivors to confront not only the death of their bodies, but the corruption of their souls. Part 8. Orphan Children in the Wasteland. In the aftermath of the Black Death's devastation, Europe faced a horror that transcended even the massive death toll itself. The sight of thousands upon thousands of children wandering alone through landscapes emptied of adult protection, guidance, and care. These were not merely orphans in the traditional sense, but survivors of catastrophe so complete that it had destroyed not just families, but entire social systems designed to protect the young. They were the living ghosts of a generation, bearing witness to humanity's greatest catastrophe while struggling to survive in a world that no longer seemed designed for human habitation. The plague had created something unprecedented in human history, a continent filled with children who had watched their entire world die around them. These young survivors, some as young as 4 or 5 years old, found themselves suddenly responsible for their own survival in an environment where the basic structures of civilization had collapsed. They were forced to become adults while still children, to make life and death decisions with minds barely old enough to understand the concept of mortality, and to navigate a world where protective barriers between childhood and the harsh realities of existence had been completely obliterated. The arithmetic of abandonment, the sheer scale of child abandonment created by the Black Death, defied medieval Europe's capacity for comprehension or response. Conservative estimates suggest that the plague created over 200,000 orphan children across the continent, though the true number was likely far higher. Entire regions saw their child populations reduced to wandering bands of survivors who had no adult supervision, no access to education, and no understanding of how to maintain the basic functions of civilized life. Brother Marcus of Canterbury, who attempted to catalog the orphan children in his region, provided statistics that revealed the magnitude of the crisis. In the Shire of Kent alone, we have identified over 300 children between the ages of 4 and 14 who have lost both parents and all other family members to the pestilence. This number grows daily as we discover new groups of young survivors hiding in abandoned buildings, empty churches, and ruined farmsteads. The distribution of these orphan children followed the plague's geographic path, with the highest concentrations found in areas that had experienced the most severe mortality. Cities that had lost 60 or 70% of their adult populations often found themselves home to dozens of parentless children who had somehow survived the catastrophe that claimed their families. Rural areas witnessed the emergence of bands of young survivors who moved from village to village, seeking food and shelter in communities that no longer had the resources to provide either. The age distribution of these orphan populations revealed another layer of tragedy. The youngest children, those under 7 years old, had the lowest survival rates without adult care. Many perished from starvation, exposure, or accident within weeks of being left alone. The children who did survive tended to be old enough to have some basic survival skills, but young enough to adapt to their new circumstances, typically between 8 and 14 years of age. The silent witnesses. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of these orphan children was their silence. Observers consistently noted that survivors of the plague, particularly the youngest ones, often stopped speaking entirely. This was not mere psychological trauma, though that was certainly present, but something deeper, a fundamental disconnect from human society that rendered normal communication meaningless. Sister Catherine of Rouen, who worked with orphan children in a makeshift shelter established in her convent, documented this phenomenon in letters to her Mother Superior. The children we care for speak little and often not at all. When they do communicate, it is through gestures and expressions that seem to belong to a different species than our own. They have seen things that have severed their connection to normal human discourse, and they exist now in a realm of experience that words cannot touch. These silent children had witnessed horrors that exceeded the capacity of young minds to process or express. They had watched parents die in agony, had seen siblings succumb to disease, had observed a complete breakdown of every adult authority figure in their lives. Many had been forced to care for dying family members while still children themselves, taking on responsibilities that would challenge adult minds and hearts. The trauma manifested in various ways beyond silence. Some children developed repetitive behaviors, rocking back and forth for hours, repeatedly washing their hands, or obsessively organizing objects. Others displayed aggressive tendencies that seemed completely disconnected from their circumstances, lashing out at helpers who tried to provide care or destroying property for no apparent reason. Still others retreated into fantasy worlds that bore no relationship to their actual surroundings, carrying on conversations with imaginary companions or insisting that dead family members were still alive and would return. Bands of young survivors. As traditional family structures disintegrated, orphan children began forming their own survival groups, makeshift families bound together by necessity rather than blood. These bands, typically consisting of 5 to 15 children ranging in age from early childhood to adolescence, developed their own hierarchies, rules, and survival strategies that often bore little resemblance to normal social organization. The leadership of these groups typically fell to the oldest children, some as young as 12 or 13, who found themselves responsible for survival of much younger siblings or unrelated children they had encountered during their wanderings. These young leaders were forced to make decisions about resource allocation, territorial disputes, and group discipline that would challenge experienced adults. Guillaume de Nanguise, a chronicler who observed these child bands near Paris, provided detailed descriptions of their organization and behavior. They moved through the abandoned countryside like small armies, led by children who have learned to think like generals despite their tender years. The older ones scout for food and shelter, while the younger ones guard their few possessions. They have developed systems of communication that rely more on hand signals and speech, and they can disappear into ruins or forests with a speed that seems almost supernatural. These survival groups developed their own moral codes that reflected their desperate circumstances. Theft from adults was considered acceptable and necessary, but stealing from other children was often punished severely. The strong had obligations to protect the weak, but resources were distributed based on contribution to group survival rather than need or sentiment. Violence was accepted as a necessary tool for survival, but cruelty for its own sake was typically discouraged. The territorial behavior of these groups created a complex geography of child survival that overlay the official boundaries of medieval Europe. Abandoned buildings, ruined churches, and empty farms were claimed and defended by these young survivors, who established their own borders and engaged in conflicts with other child groups over resources and territory. The breakdown of education and culture, the orphaning of an entire generation, created a cultural catastrophe that extended far beyond immediate survival concerns. The traditional systems of education, whether formal schooling for the wealthy or apprenticeship training for common children, had been completely disrupted by the plague's assault on adult populations. The result was a generation growing up without access to literacy, without knowledge of traditional crafts and skills, and without understanding of the cultural and religious traditions that had defined European civilization for centuries. Master Robert Oxford, one of the few university instructors to survive the plague years, attempted to assess the educational damage in his region. We find children who were learning to read before the pestilence, but who have now forgotten their letters entirely. Others who were apprenticed craftsmen have lost not only their masters, but all knowledge of their trades. Most disturbing are those who have lost their native language itself, communicating only in the crude gestures and basic sounds they had developed among themselves. The loss of religious education was particularly devastating in a society where Christian doctrine had provided the fundamental framework for understanding existence. Many orphan children had no knowledge of basic prayers, could not recognize religious symbols, and displayed complete ignorance of the holy days and festivals that had once structured medieval life. Some had developed their own primitive religious practices that combined half-remembered Christian elements with folk superstitions and practices they had invented themselves. The breakdown of gender role education created additional complications. Girls who should have been learning domestic skills from their mothers instead developed survival abilities that were traditionally masculine: hunting, fighting, and group leadership. Boys who should have been learning trades from their fathers instead became scavengers and foragers. The result was a generation that did not fit traditional social categories and could not easily be reintegrated into normal society, even when such integration became possible. Feral children of the plague. In the most extreme cases, prolonged isolation and trauma created children who had lost most recognizable human characteristics, what contemporary observers call feral children, who seem more animal than human in their behavior and responses. These children, typically the youngest survivors who had spent the longest periods without adult contact, presented challenges that medieval society had no framework for understanding or addressing. Brother Antoine of Cluny, who encountered several such children during his travels through depopulated regions, provided disturbing accounts of their condition. We found a girl perhaps 10 years living alone in the ruins of Farmstead, surviving by eating raw vegetables from an abandoned garden and drinking from puddles like a beast. She showed no recognition of human speech, fled when approached, and communicated only through growls and gestures. When we finally captured her, she fought like a wild animal and could not be made to understand that we meant her no harm. These feral children had developed survival strategies that were effective but completely outside normal human behavior. They had learned to hunt small animals with improvised weapons, to find shelter in places adults would never think to look, and to avoid human contact entirely. Many displayed heightened senses, better hearing, sharper eyesight, and keener smell, that had developed as compensation for their isolation from human society. The challenge of rehabilitating these children proved nearly impossible with medieval understanding and resources. Many could never be taught to speak normally. Others never learned to interact appropriately with other humans. And some never developed the ability to live in enclosed spaces or follow social rules. They remained permanently damaged by their experiences, living reminders of what the plague had done not just to bodies, but to the very essence of human nature. The economics of child survival. The survival of orphan children created new economic realities that medieval society was unprepared to handle. In normal times, Children had economic value as potential laborers, apprentices, or marriage partners. But the plague had created a surplus of children relative to adult supervision and economic opportunity, making them economic liabilities rather than assets. Some orphan children were absorbed into surviving households as servants or farm laborers, but these arrangements were often exploitative and provided little security or care. Others survived through begging, theft, or scavenging, developing economic strategies that existed entirely outside normal medieval commerce. The most successful young survivors often became entrepreneurs of necessity, developing skills in trade, negotiation, and resource management that exceeded those of many adults. The city of Florence, which had lost an estimated 60% of its population, found itself dealing with over 400 orphan children who had no legal guardians and no means of support. The city government, struggling to maintain basic services with a decimated workforce, had no resources to devote to child welfare and could only provide minimal emergency shelter and food. These children developed their own economic networks, trading information about food sources, shelter locations, and adult behavior patterns. They created primitive marketplaces where scavenged goods could be exchanged, and they developed credit systems based on future promises rather than immediate payment. These child economies operated according to rules that were simultaneously more brutal and more egalitarian than adult commercial practices. The lost arts of childhood. One of the most poignant aspects of the orphan generation was the complete disappearance of normal childhood activities and culture. The games, songs, and stories that have been passed down through generations were forgotten as children focused entirely on survival. The traditional markers of childhood development, First Communion, apprenticeship ceremonies, coming-of-age rituals, became meaningless when there were no adult available to provide guidance or recognition. Play, when it occurred at all among these young survivors, often took disturbing forms that reflected their traumatic experiences. Children would reenact plague scenes, play games involving death and burial, or create elaborate fantasies about rescuing parents who were never coming back. Their drawings, when materials were available, depicted scenes of massive death, empty buildings, and landscapes devoid of adult figures. The loss of lullabies and bedtime stories meant that many children lost the ability to sleep peacefully, instead experiencing chronic insomnia or nightmares that reflected their traumatic experiences. The absence of birthday celebrations, holiday traditions, and family rituals left them without temporal landmarks to structure their understanding of time and development. Language and communication in crisis. The breakdown of normal family structure had profound effects on language development among orphan children. Many began developing their own forms of communication that incorporated elements from multiple languages, gestural systems borrowed from different trades, an entirely new vocabulary created to describe experiences that had no precedent in normal human discourse. These hybrid languages served practical purposes, but also represented the emergence of a generation that was fundamentally disconnected from traditional culture. Children who could communicate effectively with their survival groups often could not understand adult speech when they encountered it, and adults found it difficult to comprehend the communication systems these young survivors had developed. The creation of new forms of communication represented both adaptation and loss. Adaptation to impossible circumstances, but loss of connection to the cultural heritage that had defined European civilization. These children were creating their own culture from the ruins of the old, but it was a culture born of trauma and survival rather than love and tradition. The future interrupted. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the orphan generation was a complete disruption of normal human development and the loss of future potential that this represented. Children who should have become craftsmen, scholars, merchants, or farmers instead became scavengers and survivors. The skills they developed, urban exploration, food location, threat assessment, and group survival, were highly specialized but largely useless for rebuilding normal society. The psychological damage inflicted on these children created a generation that would struggle throughout their lives with basic human relationships, emotional regulation, and social integration. Many would never marry, never have children of their own, and never develop capacity for the kind of trust and intimacy that normal family life required. The orphan children of the Black Death represented more than demographic loss. They embodied the complete interruption of human cultural transmission from one generation to the next. They were living symbols of what the plague had accomplished, not just the death of individuals, but the death of the future itself, as represented by children who have been forced to abandon childhood in order to survive in a world that no longer recognized their humanity or protected their innocence. These young survivors were the true inheritors of the plague years, not just witnesses to the death of their world, but a foundation upon which a new and darker world would have to be built. Their silence spoke louder than any words about what had been lost when the Black Death transformed Europe into a wasteland populated by children who had learned to survive without love, without hope, and without the basic human connections that make survival worthwhile. Part 9. The Endless Winter. By 1350, as the initial wave of the Black Death began to subside across Europe, survivors emerged from their refuges to discover that the plague had accomplished far more than mass killing. It had systematically dismantled the economic and social foundations upon which medieval civilization rested. The carefully balanced system of agricultural production, feudal obligation, and commercial exchange that had sustained European society for centuries lay in ruins, creating a cascade of secondary disasters that would prove almost as devastating as the plague itself. The world that greeted survivors was not merely depopulated, but fundamentally broken. Fields that should have been golden with grain stood empty and overgrown with weeds. Villages that thrived for generations were reduced to collections of empty buildings slowly surrendering to decay. Trade routes that had carried goods across continents had reverted to wilderness paths traveled only by wolves and desperate refugees. The Black Death had not simply killed people. It had murdered an entire way of life. The Great Agricultural Collapse. The foundation of medieval Europe's economy was agriculture, and the plague's assault on rural populations created an agricultural catastrophe that threatened the survival of everyone who had escaped the disease. The labor-intensive farming methods of the 14th century required large numbers of workers to plant, tend, and harvest crops. When the plague eliminated 60% or more of the agricultural workforce in many regions, the result was not merely reduced production, but complete agricultural collapse. Brother William of Dean, traveling to the countryside of Kent in the autumn of 1349, documented the scope of agricultural devastation. The fields stretched empty to the horizon, their crops rotting where they stand for lack of hands to harvest them. Wheat that could feed thousands lies moldering in abandoned fields, while the few survivors in nearby villages face starvation because they lacked the knowledge or strength to gather what nature had provided. The timing of the plague's peak mortality proved particularly catastrophic for agricultural production. The disease struck hardest during the spring and summer months of 1348 and 1349, precisely when crops needed to be planted, tended, and harvested. This meant that even regions with relatively high survival rates often lost entire years of food production, creating famine conditions that persisted long after the plague itself had passed. The loss of agricultural knowledge proved as devastating as the loss of agricultural labor. Medieval farming was a complex craft that required understanding of soil conditions, weather patterns, crop rotation, and animal husbandry. This knowledge was typically passed down through generations of farming families and was embedded in local customs and traditions. When entire farming communities perished, centuries of accumulated agricultural wisdom died with them. Master Geoffrey of Henley, steward of a large estate in Oxfordshire, attempted to restart agricultural production using urban refugees who had never worked in fields. We have survivors willing to work, but they know nothing of farming. They plant seeds at the wrong depth, harvest crops before they are ripe, and cannot distinguish between wheat and weeds. It is like trying to rebuild a cathedral using men who have never seen stone or mortar. The breakdown of the feudal system. The feudal system that had organized European society for centuries was built upon a delicate balance of obligations and services that connected everyone from peasant farmers to great lords in a web of mutual dependence. The Black Death shattered the system by eliminating so many participants that the remaining survivors could not maintain the complex relationships that feudalism required. The death of feudal lords left vast estates without leadership or organization. Peasants who had been bound to the land for generations found themselves suddenly free simply because there was no one left to enforce their obligations. Manor houses stood empty while their former serfs wandered the countryside as free men. Though freedom in a world without functioning institutions proved to be a mixed blessing. Sir John de Grey, one of the few English nobles to survive the plague with his family relatively intact, described the collapse of feudal relationships in his region. My vassals are dead, my peasants have fled, and my lands lie empty. The few survivors owe me no allegiance, for they have seen that lordship provides no protection against death, and that noble birth offers no immunity from corruption. The bonds that held our society together have dissolved as completely as if they were made of morning mist. The collapse of feudal military service left entire regions defenseless against banditry and violence. The feudal levy system had depended on lords who could call upon their vassals to provide armed service in exchange for protection and land grants. When both lords and vassals died in massive numbers, this military organization simply ceased to exist, leaving communities vulnerable to attack from brigands, foreign raiders, and desperate refugees. The labor revolution. In regions where agricultural production continued, the massive reduction in available workers created unprecedented changes in the relationship between laborers and landowners. Surviving peasants found themselves in position to demand wages, choose their employers, and negotiate working conditions, luxuries that had been unthinkable under the rigid hierarchies of the feudal system. The transformation of labor relations happened with startling speed. Walter of Henley, whose agricultural treatise had been standard reading for estate managers, found his advice obsolete almost overnight. The old methods of managing serfs and villains no longer apply when there are 3 positions available for every worker. Peasants who once begged for the right to work their lord's lands now demand payment in silver, shorter working hours, and the freedom to leave at harvest time if they find better opportunities elsewhere. This revolution in labor relations terrified surviving members of the nobility, who recognized that their traditional authority was evaporating along with their workforce. Attempts to maintain pre-plague wage levels and working conditions through legislation were largely unsuccessful, as workers could simply move to regions where better terms were offered. The English Statute of Laborers, enacted in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from moving between employers. Similar legislation was passed across Europe, but enforcement proved impossible when labor was so scarce that any employer willing to ignore the law could easily attract workers from competitors who tried to comply. Urban economic collapse. The plague's impact on medieval cities was equally devastating, but manifested in different ways than rural collapse. Urban economies depended on complex networks of trade, manufacturing, and service provision that required large populations of skilled workers. When these populations were decimated by disease, entire industries simply disappeared. The great cloth-making cities of Flanders provide a stark example of urban economic collapse. Ypres, Bruges, and Ghent have been among Europe's wealthiest and most populous cities. Their prosperity built on textile production that employed thousands of skilled weavers, dyers, and merchants. The plague reduced these metropolises to shadows of their former selves, with entire neighborhoods of workshops standing empty and their equipment slowly rusting into uselessness. Master Jan van Brugge, who had overseen textile production in Bruges before the plague, returned to the city in 1350 to find an economic wasteland. The loom stands silent, covered in dust and spider webs. The dye vats that once bubbled with activity now hold only stagnant water. The merchant houses that once conducted business with London, Paris, and even Constantinople are boarded up and empty. The knowledge of how to create the fine cloths that made our city famous has died with the craftsmen who possessed it. The loss of skilled artisans proved particularly devastating because medieval crafts required years of training and experience to master. A master goldsmith, stone carver, or illuminated manuscript creator represented decades of accumulated knowledge and skill. When these craftsmen died, their knowledge died with them, and there were often no apprentices or journeymen left to carry on their trades. The collapse of international trade, the commercial networks that had connected medieval Europe to the broader world economy, were among the plague's most prominent casualties. The great trading companies of Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League had built their wealth on complex systems of credit, transportation, and communication that required large numbers of trained personnel and stable political conditions. The plague destroyed both. The famous Medici banking houses, which have financed trade across Europe and beyond, found their operations crippled not just by the death of key personnel, but by the collapse of their customer base. When entire cities lost half their population and regional economies ceased to function, There was simply no demand for the sophisticated financial services that had driven medieval commerce. Marco di Bartolomeo, a Venetian merchant who had conducted business from London to Constantinople before the plague, documented the collapse of international trade. The routes that once carried silk from China and spices from India now see only occasional travelers bearing news of distant catastrophes. The markets of Champagne, where merchants from across Europe once gathered annually, have not been held for 2 years. Ships rot in harbors because there are neither goods to carry nor markets to receive them. Famine among the survivors. The collapse of agricultural production created widespread famine among plague survivors, adding a cruel irony to their situation. Those who had escaped the disease now found themselves facing starvation in regions that had previously been agricultural surplus producers. The breakdown of food distribution systems meant that even areas with successful harvests could not get their produce to markets where it was desperately needed. The psychological impact of famine after plague was particularly devastating. Survivors who had endured the horror of watching family members die from disease now faced the prospect of dying from hunger. Many reported that starvation felt like a betrayal, as if having survived the plague should have guaranteed their safety from other forms of death. Sister Agnes of Norwich, who distributed food to famine victims from her convent's dwindling stores, described the desperation of plague survivors facing starvation. They come to us bearing the marks of their survival, the hollow eyes of those who have seen too much death, the trembling hands of those who have learned to fear every stranger. But now they bear also the swollen bellies and wasted limbs of starvation, as if having escaped one form of death, they must now face another. Peasant revolts and social upheaval. The combination of labor scarcity, economic collapse, and a breakdown of traditional authority created conditions ripe for social revolution across Europe. Surviving peasants began to question not just specific policies, but the entire social order that had kept them in bondage for generations. If the plague could kill lords and peasants with equal indifference, what divine sanction could aristocratic privilege claim? The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though occurring decades after the plague's initial impact, had its roots in the social upheaval created by the Black Death. The famous declaration of the rebel priest John Ball, when Adam Delve and Eve Spann, who was then a gentleman, articulated a revolutionary questioning of social hierarchy that the plague had made thinkable by demonstrating that death recognized no social distinctions. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe as surviving peasants demanded not just better wages, but fundamental changes to the social order. The Jacquerie in France, peasant revolts in Flanders, and urban uprisings in German cities all reflected the same underlying reality. The plague had destroyed the legitimacy of traditional authority along with the institutions that enforced it. The death of medieval civilization. By 1350, it was clear that the Black Death had accomplished something unprecedented in European history: the effective termination of an entire civilization. The medieval world that had emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire and had flourished for nearly 1,000 years was dying along with its inhabitants. The symptoms of civilizational collapse were visible everywhere. Legal systems ceased to function when there were no judges, lawyers, or court officials to operate them. Educational institutions closed when there were no teachers or students to maintain them. Religious institutions struggled to perform basic functions when most of their clergy had died or fled. Chronicles and record-keeping, the institutional memory of medieval society, simply stopped in many regions. The careful documentation that had recorded births, deaths, property transfers, and political events for centuries was abandoned as the scribes and clerks who maintained these records either died or found themselves overwhelmed by more immediate survival concerns. Brother Matthew of Westminster, attempting to maintain his monastery's chronicle during the plague years, captured the sense of civilizational ending. The world we knew is passing away before our eyes, and we who remain lack the strength or wisdom to preserve what is being lost. Libraries stand empty. Schools are abandoned, and the accumulated knowledge of centuries molders in unused books. We are witnessing not just the death of people, but the death of all that made us human. The Black Death had accomplished what no barbarian invasion, natural disaster, or political upheaval had ever achieved: the systematic destruction of European civilization from within. The survivors who emerged from this catastrophe would have to rebuild not just their communities and institutions, but their entire understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where death had proven more powerful than all the achievements of human culture and faith combined. Ypres, Bruges, and Ghent had been among Europe's wealthiest and most populous cities, their prosperity built on textile production that employed thousands of skilled weavers, dyers, and merchants. The plague reduced these metropolises to shadows of their former selves, with entire neighborhoods of workshops standing empty and their equipment slowly rusting into uselessness. Master Jan van Brugge, who had overseen textile production in Bruges before the plague, returned to the city in 1350 to find an economic wasteland. The loom stands silent, covered in dust and spider webs. The dye vats that once bubbled with activity now hold only stagnant water. The merchant houses that once conducted business with London, Paris, and even Constantinople are boarded up and empty. The knowledge of how to create the fine cloths that made our city famous has died with the craftsmen who possessed it. The loss of skilled artisans proved particularly devastating because medieval crafts required years of training and experience to master. A master goldsmith, stone carver, or illuminated manuscript creator represented decades of accumulated knowledge and skill. When these craftsmen died, their knowledge died with them, and there were often no apprentices or journeymen left to carry on their trades. The collapse of international trade, the commercial networks that had connected medieval Europe to the broader world economy, were among the plague's most prominent casualties. The great trading companies of Venice, Genoa, and the Hanseatic League had built their wealth on complex systems of credit, transportation, and communication that required large numbers of trained personnel and stable political conditions. The plague destroyed both. The famous Medici banking houses, which had financed trade across Europe and beyond, found their operations crippled not just by the death of key personnel, but by the collapse of their customer base. When entire cities lost half their population and regional economies ceased to function, there was simply no demand for sophisticated financial services that had driven medieval commerce. Marco di Bartolomeo, a Venetian merchant who had conducted business from London to Constantinople before the plague, documented the collapse of international trade. The routes that once carried silk from China and spices from India now see only occasional travelers bearing news of distant catastrophes. The markets of Champagne, where merchants from across Europe once gathered annually, have not been held for 2 years. Ships rot in harbors because there are neither goods to carry nor markets to receive them. Famine among the survivors. The collapse of agricultural production created widespread famine among plague survivors, adding a cruel irony to their situation. Those who had escaped the disease now found themselves facing starvation in regions that had previously been agricultural surplus producers. The breakdown of food distribution systems meant that even areas with successful harvests could not get their produce to markets where it was desperately needed. The psychological impact of famine after plague was particularly devastating. Survivors who had endured the horror of watching family members die from disease now faced the prospect of dying from hunger. Many reported that starvation felt like betrayal, as if having survived the plague should have guaranteed their safety from other forms of death. Sister Agnes of Norwich, who distributed food to famine victims from her convent's dwindling stores, described the desperation of plague survivors facing starvation. They come to us bearing the marks of their survival, the hollow eyes of those who have seen too much death, the trembling hands of those who have learned to fear every stranger. But now they bear also the swollen bellies and wasted limbs of starvation, as if having escaped one form of death, they must now face another. Peasant revolts and social upheaval. The combination of labor scarcity, economic collapse, and the breakdown of traditional authority created conditions ripe for social revolution. Across Europe, surviving peasants began to question not just specific policies, but the entire social order that had kept them in bondage for generations. If the plague could kill lords and peasants with equal indifference, what divine sanction could aristocratic privilege claim? The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though occurring decades after the plague's initial impact, had its roots in the social upheaval created by the Black Death. The famous declaration of the rebel priest John Ball, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman, articulated a revolutionary questioning of social hierarchy that the plague had made thinkable by demonstrating that death recognized no social distinctions. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe as surviving peasants demanded not just better wages, but fundamental changes to the social order. The Jacquerie in France, peasant revolts in Flanders, and urban uprisings in German cities all reflected the same underlying reality. The plague had destroyed the legitimacy of traditional authority along with the institutions that enforced it. The death of medieval civilization. By 1350, it was clear that the Black Death had accomplished something unprecedented in European history: the effective termination of an entire civilization. The medieval world that had emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire and had flourished for nearly 1,000 years was dying along with its inhabitants. The symptoms of civilizational collapse were visible everywhere. Legal systems ceased to function when there were no judges, lawyers, or court officials to operate them. Educational institutions closed when there were no teachers or students to maintain them. Religious institutions struggled to perform basic functions when most of their clergy had died or fled. Chronicles and record-keeping, the institutional memory of medieval society, simply stopped in many regions. The careful documentation that had recorded births, deaths, property transfers, and political events for centuries was abandoned as the scribes and clerks who maintained these records either died or found themselves overwhelmed by more immediate survival concerns. Brother Matthew of Westminster, attempting to maintain his monastery's chronicle during the plague years, captured the sense of civilizational ending. The world we knew is passing away before our eyes, and we who remain lack the strength or wisdom to preserve what is being lost. Libraries stand empty. Schools are abandoned, and the accumulated knowledge of centuries molders in unused books. We are witnessing not just the death of people, but the death of all that made us human. The Black Death had accomplished what no barbarian invasion, natural disaster, or political upheaval had ever achieved: the systematic destruction of European civilization from within. The survivors who emerged from this catastrophe would have to rebuild not just their communities and institutions, but their entire understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where death had proven more powerful than all the achievements of human culture and faith combined.